The northern lands stretched in silence beneath vast skies that shifted from brilliant summer light to crushing winter darkness. Towering mountains pressed against narrow valleys, their snow-bound peaks gleaming like cold guardians of the fjords below. These fjords cut deep into the body of Norway, carving narrow channels where seawater pushed inland for many miles, creating natural harbors that were both a blessing and a trap. For those who lived along their edges, the sea was not merely a neighbor, but a lifeline, because the jagged ridges and steep slopes behind the small fields offered little chance for farming beyond the thin strips of soil that clung to the valley floors. Communities grew in pockets of arable land where grain could just barely take root, where sheep and goats grazed on precarious slopes, and where every family counted each harvest with anxious eyes. When winter came, the same mountains that had framed their villages became walls of isolation. Snow drifted until it reached the roof beams of houses, locking people inside with only their stored supplies and shared warmth to sustain them. In those months, life contracted into dimly lit halls where fires smoked and crackled while winds howled outside. In Sweden, the landscape was different but equally demanding. Endless forests of spruce and pine stretched across the interior, broken only by glimmering lakes and rivers that lay frozen for half the year. These waterways were natural roads in summer, linking scattered settlements through trade and kinship ties, yet in the frozen months they became barriers that cut one village off from another. The people who lived here adapted by mastering the rhythm of seasons, building boats for the warm months and sledges for the long winters. The coast presented another challenge altogether, with its scatter of rocky islands forming mazes that required steady hands and sharp eyes to navigate. Here, seamanship was not a skill acquired for glory, but an inheritance essential for survival. Denmark offered its people flatter lands, but its wide stretches were broken by countless inlets and islands. Farming was more forgiving here than in the craggy valleys of Norway, yet the sea still dictated the pattern of life. The islands were scattered like stepping stones, demanding ships to bridge them, and so even those who tilled fertile fields grew up watching sails catch the wind. For all of Scandinavia, the rhythm of life was dictated by short summers and long winters, where survival depended on foresight and cooperation as much as on courage. The climate added another burden to these landscapes. Winters could stretch for half a year, with temperatures plunging until water froze solid in buckets left near the hearth. Darkness pressed down, broken only by the pale glow of firelight and the flickering of auroras that rippled across the night sky like celestial banners. When snow reached the height of a man, travel ceased except for the most urgent need. Villages became isolated islands in a white sea, each household relying on what had been laid aside in summer and autumn. Grain stores, salted fish, dried meat, and woven cloth, all were carefully guarded, for a mistake in planning could mean starvation before the thaw. When the sun returned, it did so in a blaze of urgency. The growing season was swift and merciless, demanding every hand to work without pause. Fields were ploughed and planted, nets mended, and livestock driven to pasture. Those who farmed knew their efforts might only just keep hunger at bay. To depend on agriculture alone was to live in constant uncertainty. Thus fishing became an anchor, with the sea offering cod, herring, and seals to supplement what the fields could not provide. Hunting in the forests for elk, bear, and smaller game added further to survival, though none of these pursuits offered true security. The pressures of this existence taught resilience and flexibility. People learned to read the skies, to anticipate storms, and to navigate waterways as if they were familiar paths across a village field. Skills of boat building and seamanship were not luxuries, they were foundations upon which survival rested. To drift too far from the sea was to risk hunger, but to embrace it opened doors not only to food, but to connection with distant places. The sea gave as much as it took away, and those who lived by it came to understand its moods, as they might the temperament of kin. This dependence on water routes shaped more than just travel. It bred a culture where isolation could be broken only by taking to the waves, where trade and exchange with distant neighbors were the only remedies to scarcity. Small settlements scattered along fjords, islands, and riverbanks began to lean on one another, bound by boats that carried goods, news, and sometimes weapons. Children learned early the feel of oars in hand, the sound of waves slapping against wooden hulls, and the shift of wind against sail. In such a world, to master the sea was to master fate. This environment hardened its people, but also instilled a restless adaptability. A family might survive one season through farming, another through fishing, and yet another by following chiefs on expeditions where foreign wealth could be won. The challenges of the land ensured that no single path was sufficient. Survival meant blending them all, labor in the fields, risk on the waves, and when needed, the willingness to reach beyond the horizon. The landscape itself encouraged independence. With mountains and forests dividing valleys, each community developed around its own resources and leadership. Local chieftains rose not through inherited titles alone, but by proving themselves capable of protecting people and providing for them when harvests failed. In this way, the terrain shaped both character and politics, demanding leaders who could inspire loyalty not through decree, but through generosity, courage, and success in ventures beyond the fields. As generations passed, these lessons became ingrained in memory and story. Elders spoke of harsh winters overcome through clever planning, of voyages where storms nearly swallowed men whole, and of years when fish shoals saved entire villages from famine. The young listened closely, for these tales were not mere entertainment, but guides for the future. To live in such lands was to grow with an awareness of fragility and resilience alike. What began as necessity evolved into identity. By the time the world would come to know them as Vikings, the people of these northern lands had already been tempered by geography and climate into communities that valued endurance, courage, and the sea's restless promise. Their world was carved by fjords, forests, and ice, but within those limits they discovered skills and ambitions that would one day carry them far beyond their homeland. The centuries before the first sails of Viking raiders appeared on foreign horizons were far from quiet. The foundations of their society had been laid in an earlier age, when Scandinavian lands began to shift from loosely connected tribal groups toward more defined cultures and hierarchies. This era, often remembered as the Vendel period, took its name from the rich burial finds in upland Sweden, where excavated graves revealed treasures that spoke of wealth, ambition, and a growing aristocracy. Within these mounds lay helmets adorned with intricate designs, swords forged with patterned steel, and ornaments crafted to display prestige rather than necessity. Each grave told the story of a people transforming their place in the world, moving beyond subsistence toward a vision of power rooted in display and reputation. The warrior aristocracy that rose during this time was not merely a class of fighters. These leaders emerged as figures who could marshal men, control trade routes, and demonstrate authority through both generosity and ferocity. They drew strength from their ability to redistribute wealth, rewarding loyal followers with gifts and favors gained through long-distance exchange. Power was measured not only in the size of a warband, but in the treasures one could offer at a feast, in the exotic silks draped across hall benches, or the Byzantine coins displayed as proof of journeys across distant seas. Trade stretched far beyond Scandinavia. Amber collected from Baltic shores was prized in distant markets. Furs from the northern forests were sought by nobles who valued their warmth, and rarity. Iron extracted from bog deposits in Sweden became a crucial resource, shaping weapons and tools that traveled far from their origins. In return, silver flowed into the north along with glassware, fine textiles, and spices carried across continents by merchants from Byzantium and the Islamic world. Such exchanges connected the seemingly remote fjords and forests of Scandinavia to a broader web of wealth and influence, ensuring that even distant chieftains possessed links to global commerce. This era also marked the gradual separation of Scandinavian culture from its Germanic kin on the continent. While earlier centuries had seen migration and shared traditions among Germanic peoples, the geography of the north enforced both isolation and adaptation. Language evolved into distinct forms, and Old Norse began to shape itself apart from the Gothic, Frankish, or Anglo-Saxon dialects. Customs, too, acquired new flavors, tailored to the demands of seafaring life and the challenges of a rugged environment. Religion reflected this change as gods became more closely aligned with the concerns of maritime and warrior cultures. Odin, with his all-seeing wisdom and mastery of war, rose in prominence as the figure who guided leaders through both strategy and sacrifice. Thor, hammer in hand, became the protector of those who braved storms on open waters, his name invoked before voyages where lives depended on safe passage. These divine figures mirrored the realities of those who carved their existence between frozen fields and turbulent seas, embodying both the ferocity and resilience their followers required. Leadership remained fragmented. Unlike the centralized monarchies taking shape elsewhere in Europe, the north was governed by multiple kings, each holding sway over a cluster of settlements. Authority was not cemented through bureaucracy, but through personal bonds. A ruler's strength came from his reputation in battle, his generosity in feast halls, and his ability to lead successful raids or expeditions. Lavish gatherings where mead flowed and gifts were distributed became more than celebrations. They were vital performances of power. Warriors pledged their loyalty in exchange for rewards, while chiefs demonstrated their capacity to uphold honor and abundance. The consolidation of power was slow and fragile. A chieftain could rise through victory and fall just as swiftly through defeat or poor harvest. Ambition drove constant competition, with rival leaders challenging one another through raids, alliances, and marriages. Yet within this turbulence lay the seeds of a society that valued adaptability and courage, where success was rewarded and failure was punished without hesitation. Technological advancement played a crucial role in this transition. Early Scandinavian boats were simple, suited only for short journeys along rivers or coasts. Yet as trade expanded and the desire for power grew, so did the need for vessels capable of longer voyages and larger crews. Innovations in hull design and construction transformed small craft into ships that could withstand both coastal waters and open seas. Overlapping planks riveted together created flexible yet resilient hulls that bent with waves instead of resisting them. These ships became both practical tools and symbols of wealth, requiring the labor of many skilled hands and resources that only the wealthy could command. The communities that thrived during this period learned to value mobility. Farming was often precarious, trade was seasonal, and weather dictated every aspect of life. To endure, people had to be ready to shift between roles: farmer in one season, fisherman in another, warrior or trader when opportunity allowed. This adaptability not only supported survival but also fueled the ambition to look outward, to see beyond the narrow valleys and dark winters toward places where greater abundance might be found. The Vendel graves reveal more than status. They tell of an emerging identity shaped by a fusion of necessity and opportunity. Helmets decorated with animal motifs suggested both protection and spiritual guardianship, while swords with intricate patterns carried both deadly purpose and aesthetic pride. These artifacts show a people who saw no distinction between utility and symbolism, for to wield a fine weapon was to carry a story of lineage, craftsmanship, and divine favor. By the close of the 8th century, this society had matured into a culture both rooted in its harsh homeland and restless for expansion. The isolation enforced by mountains and seas had not bred stagnation, but sharpened ingenuity. The traditions of gift-giving, of feasting, of competition among chiefs, and the relentless pursuit of resources beyond what the land could offer. All of these converged to set the stage for what the world would later call the Viking Age. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Out of forests, fjords, and icy seas, a people emerged who would test the boundaries of their world. Their identity was no longer solely tied to their valleys or farms, but to the ships they built, the gods they invoked, and the horizons they dared to cross. The Vendel period had sown the seeds. The harvest to come would shake the foundations of kingdoms far beyond their northern home. The shaping of identity in the north did not rest solely on material wealth or the ships that carried men to distant shores. At its heart, the society of the early Norse was bound together by belief, ritual, and the fragile threads of authority spun by men who called themselves kings. These kings were not monarchs in the sense understood in other parts of Europe. Their rule was not guaranteed by sprawling bureaucracies or the weight of hereditary law, but was instead secured by personal strength, reputation, and the fragile loyalty of warriors and farmers who chose to follow them. The gods whom these people honored reflected their world. Odin stood foremost, one-eyed and ever watchful, the god who sacrificed much for wisdom and who demanded sacrifice in return. His patronage of warriors and rulers made him the deity most closely tied to the ambitions of chiefs who sought legitimacy. Thor, by contrast, was the guardian of seafarers, the hammer-bearer who protected both farmers and sailors alike from the threats of giants and the chaos of storms. His popularity among common folk reflected the reliance they placed on divine strength to safeguard journeys and crops. Other gods held their place in the pantheon: Freya for fertility, Freya for love and sorcery, Njord for the sea and wealth, but Odin and Thor came to embody the very essence of Norse resilience and courage. Religious practices were woven into daily life rather than isolated in temples alone. Sacrifices of animals and sometimes humans were made at sacred groves, burial mounds, or gatherings near prominent stones. Seasonal rituals marked the turning of the year, the sowing of crops, the harvest, the deep of winter when light returned. These rites ensured not only divine favor but also the cohesion of the community. When chiefs presided over sacrifices, they reinforced their connection to the gods, displaying their role as intermediaries between mortal and divine. The authority of kings grew out of such rituals and displays. Unlike the centralized rulers of Frankish or Byzantine lands, Scandinavian kings shared power with rival claimants, often ruling side by side or in competition within the same region. A single valley might swear allegiance to one king while the next valley followed another, and both could claim legitimate rule. The strength of a king lay not in legal decrees but in the network of warriors, farmers, and allies who saw advantage in supporting him. Should he falter in war or feast, his followers might drift to another leader, more capable of protecting them or providing wealth. Feasts held particular weight in this balance of power. In great halls with smoke-darkened rafters, kings and chieftains displayed their generosity. Mead flowed from horns, roasted meat was shared from platters, and gifts were handed out before the assembled company. Rings, swords, and ornaments of silver or gold were more than adornments, they were tokens of loyalty. To sit in the hall of a generous lord was to be bound by obligation, for the gift created a debt of service that could only be repaid through valor in battle or loyalty in council. The bond between lord and follower was forged in these moments, each man aware that wealth and safety depended on the strength of this relationship. Conflict was ever present. The landscape itself, fractured by fjords, mountains, and rivers, fostered division as much as unity. Ambitious leaders sought to expand their influence beyond their home valleys, sometimes through marriage alliances, sometimes through raids against neighbors. The resulting clashes were not mindless violence, but contests for honor, resources, and followers. A king who triumphed gained both prestige and the ability to expand his network of loyalty. One who failed might see his hall abandoned, his lineage weakened, and his name fade into obscurity. Language, too, played its role in shaping a shared identity. Old Norse, emerging from its Germanic roots, became a tongue rich in poetry and capable of carrying both lore and legend. Skalds, the poets of the age, wove stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors into verse that was recited at feasts and assemblies. Their words preserved memory, celebrated victories, and ensured that deeds, whether of gods or men, were not lost to silence. Through their verses, the ideals of courage, generosity, and loyalty were carved into the cultural consciousness, guiding behavior as firmly as any written code. Assemblies known as things offered another layer of order in a society where kingship was fragile. Here, free men gathered to settle disputes, decide on punishments, and affirm community decisions. Though kings presided over some of these gatherings, their authority was shared with the collective voice of those present. The thing provided a stage for negotiation and compromise, a counterbalance to the violence that often accompanied power struggles. The existence of such assemblies underscored the blend of independence and cooperation that defined Scandinavian life. The world beyond their homelands was never far from their imagination. Tales carried back by traders and travelers described distant lands rich in silver, silk, and strange customs. These stories stoked both envy and ambition. Chiefs who longed to strengthen their position looked outward, recognizing that the sea offered not only fish, but access to treasures far beyond what their fields or forests could provide. The horizon became not a barrier, but an invitation. By the late 8th century, the society of the North had crystallized into a culture defined by restless ambition, harsh necessity, and spiritual conviction. Kings ruled by charisma and strength, gods demanded reverence and sacrifice, and loyalty was forged in feasts as much as in battle. Old Norse words filled the air with sagas of heroes and gods, carrying both warning and inspiration. The stage was nearly set for the world to learn the name of these people, though the first thunder of their sails on foreign shores had yet to break. The earliest ships of the North were humble, fashioned from single logs hollowed by fire and tooled into dugout canoes. These vessels sufficed for fishing close to shore or crossing rivers, but they were bound by the limitations of size and strength. As generations passed, necessity pressed for greater innovation. The communities that relied upon water routes for survival needed boats that could carry families, goods, and warriors across longer distances, through unpredictable seas and into rivers where shallow drafts were essential. Out of this need, the foundations of a shipbuilding tradition were laid, one that would eventually reshape the course of history. The key transformation came with the clinker-built hull, a method where planks overlapped and were fastened with iron rivets. Unlike flat joins, the overlapping edges created flexibility, allowing the vessel to bend with the waves rather than resist them. This resilience meant that ships could venture into rougher waters with reduced risk of splitting apart. The technique demanded precision. Each plank had to be shaped to follow the curve of the hull, ensuring both strength and a watertight seal. Such craftsmanship required skill passed from master to apprentice, the knowledge preserved as carefully as any saga or lore. The addition of sails magnified the potential of these vessels. Early boats had relied on oars alone, limiting range and exhausting their crews. With a square sail of wool treated with animal fats or resins to withstand weather, ships could capture wind and travel far beyond what muscle power allowed. Oars remained for maneuvering in narrow channels or for pushing against calm seas, but the marriage of sail and oar created vessels unmatched in versatility. With these ships, a crew could cross coastal waters in hours, ride the open sea to distant lands, or slide silently into shallow rivers where other fleets could not follow. Another crucial innovation was the shallow draft. Unlike the deep keels of Mediterranean or continental ships, these hulls could skim over coastal shallows and river mouths. A Viking ship could land directly on a beach, unload its cargo or warriors, and depart again without waiting for tides or the shelter of a harbour. This design blurred the line between sea and land, giving these people a freedom of movement that baffled their enemies. No settlement along the shore was beyond their reach. Flexibility extended beyond navigation. Deck planking could be removed to make space for cargo, turning a warship into a trader's vessel when needed. The same ship that bore warriors on one voyage might carry livestock and goods on the next. This adaptability reflected the broader culture. Just as families shifted between farming, fishing, and raiding according to the season, so too could their ships serve many roles. The creation of such vessels demanded cooperation across crafts. Oak provided the preferred wood for keels and planking, prized for its strength and resistance to rot. Pine and other lighter woods filled out interior structures. Blacksmiths forged rivets and nails, each requiring skill and patience. Women labored to weave the great woolen sails, a task that consumed countless hours at the loom. A single longship represented the combined effort of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people. It was both an investment and a symbol of community strength. Decoration played its part as well. Dragon heads carved at the prow were not idle ornaments. They proclaimed power, intimidated enemies, and embodied the spirit of the vessel. Shields painted in bold colors lined the sides, transforming the ship itself into a statement of identity and pride. These vessels were more than tools. They were floating expressions of wealth, artistry, and ambition. To command a ship was to command respect. The prestige of shipbuilding also reshaped politics. Chiefs who could commission and maintain fleets rose above rivals who lacked the resources. A war band without ships was bound to its homeland. One with ships could raid, trade, and project power across seas. Ambitious young men flocked to the halls of leaders who boasted fleets, eager for the chance to gain wealth and renown abroad. Thus, ships became the foundations of both political authority and personal advancement. The evolution toward the longship, the most iconic of these creations, was gradual but decisive. The keel, often fashioned from a single massive oak, gave both strength and flexibility. Steering boards mounted on the starboard side granted control, replacing earlier, less reliable methods. Designs balanced speed with capacity, enabling swift strikes as well as sustained voyages. The longship became a weapon as much as a tool, a creation that blended practicality with terror. To see one appear on the horizon was to know that the sea itself had delivered an enemy. Other ship types served different purposes. The Nar, broader and deeper, was built for trade, carrying heavy cargoes across the open sea. These vessels enabled long-distance exchange, binding Scandinavia to markets as far as the Byzantine Empire. Even as warriors pursued plunder, merchants plied routes that brought silver, silk, and spices into northern halls. In both cases, the ship stood at the center of life, whether carrying warriors to foreign monasteries or goods to foreign markets. It was the vessel that defined opportunity. The building of ships also nurtured an intimate relationship between man and sea. Every voyage began with ritual, offerings made to secure divine favor. A ship was treated as a living companion, often given a name, spoken of as if it possessed will and spirit. The launching of a new vessel was a moment of ceremony, watched by entire communities who understood that their future might ride upon its strength. By the time the 8th century turned, the Scandinavian peoples had developed not only ships of extraordinary design, but also the skills to master them. Navigation by sun, stars, and the flight of birds guided them across waters that to others seemed impassable. Experience honed judgment of tides, currents, and weather patterns. Their confidence grew with each successful voyage, each return laden with goods or tales of distant lands. Thus, the longship and its kin became more than instruments of survival. They became the vehicles of destiny. With them, the people of the north could move beyond their fragmented valleys and frozen fields, testing the boundaries of their known world. What had begun as necessity had evolved into mastery. The horizon no longer seemed a barrier, but a promise, and soon the world would feel the thunder of oars and the snap of sails driven by ambition and need. In the society that took shape across Scandinavia, a clear hierarchy governed daily life, though it allowed for shifts born of ambition and fortune. At the summit stood the jarls, men of noble lineage who commanded the largest estates and wielded power through wealth, warriors, and tradition. They claimed descent from gods or legendary heroes, tracing bloodlines that gave divine sanction to their rule. Their halls rose largest among the settlements, timbered structures where dozens could gather, their size and decoration a physical reminder of status. To sit in the presence of a jarl was to witness both authority and generosity, for their power depended not only on fear, but on their capacity to reward. The jarl's wealth rested on control of land and resources. They possessed farms that stretched wider than others, with slaves and tenants to work them. They directed access to iron deposits, to timber stands, to fishing grounds that sustained communities. Feasts in their halls were opportunities to display this abundance. Warriors were rewarded with weapons, finely wrought jewelry, and the promise of future spoils. The jarl's ability to maintain loyalty rested on his skill as a leader of raids and expeditions, as well as his role as arbiter in disputes. Around him clustered lesser chieftains and ambitious men who sought advancement through service. Beneath the jarls stood the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of society. They owned land, though holdings varied from expansive farms to modest plots barely sustaining a family. Regardless of wealth, their freedom marked them apart. They could bear arms, attend the assemblies known as things, and seek justice through law rather than submission. This independence distinguished them from the serfs of other lands, for they owed no feudal bond that reduced them to vassals. Their loyalty to jarls was earned, not bound, and could be withdrawn if leadership faltered. The carls blended occupations according to season and need. In spring and summer they ploughed and sowed, while autumn demanded harvests and preparation for winter. Along coasts and lakes, many added fishing to their livelihood, drying and salting catches to survive the frozen months. Others turned to crafts, shaping iron into tools and weapons, carving wood into ships, or weaving cloth for trade. Ambitious carls might join expeditions abroad, drawn by the promise of silver and fame that could elevate their status at home. In this way, a man of humble beginnings could climb toward wealth, his name carried in skaldic verse if fortune favored him. At the base of the social pyramid were the thralls, slaves who possessed no rights. They were captured in raids, born into bondage, or reduced by debt. Their lives were spent in labor, tilling fields, tending livestock, chopping wood, or serving in households. Women among them spun and wove, cooked and cleaned, or endured lives as concubines. Men performed the harshest tasks, whether clearing forests or working in mines. Their fate depended entirely on the will of their masters, who could trade, punish, or even kill them without legal consequence. Yet slavery in these lands was not always permanent. Some thralls earned or purchased freedom, gradually merging into the class of carls. Others were released through acts of generosity by masters seeking favor with gods or men. Even so, their role remained vital to the economy, for their labor freed free men to raid, trade, and govern. Captives taken abroad became a commodity in themselves, sold in distant markets where their value in silver was often greater than any other spoils of war. The relationships between these classes were fluid in practice. A successful warrior might rise from carls to jarl through valor and cunning. A jarl who failed in battle or squandered resources could see his followers abandon him, his authority crumbling. This movement was part of what kept the society dynamic, rewarding achievement while punishing weakness. It created a culture where ambition was never still, where men sought glory to secure a place above their peers. Law and custom reinforced this order. At the Thing, free men gathered to voice disputes and decide matters of importance. The presence of jarls gave weight to decisions, but the assembly's collective nature preserved a sense of balance. Justice often took the form of compensation rather than execution, with silver, goods, or land offered to settle grievances. This practice prevented endless cycles of vengeance and kept fragile communities from collapsing into blood feuds. Still, honor demanded that insults or injuries not go unanswered, and duels or raids sometimes erupted when settlements failed. Women's roles in this hierarchy carried their own significance. Free women managed households, controlled property in some cases, and acted as guardians of family honor. Their skill in weaving produced the sails that carried ships abroad. Their management of farms ensured survival while men voyaged, and their presence in assemblies influenced negotiations. Noblewomen in particular held sway through marriages that forged alliances, and sagas remember figures who defended estates, guided sons, or exacted vengeance. Though the world was male-dominated, women's contributions were vital threads in the social fabric. The hall embodied these distinctions. Within its walls, the jarl sat high, surrounded by retainers, while free men clustered closer to the hearth and thralls served at benches. Skalds recited verses that praised exploits, their words reinforcing the bonds of loyalty and honor. The sharing of food, the giving of gifts, and the drinking of mead cemented relationships that structured society. To be included in the hall was to belong, to be excluded was to risk insignificance. This layered society, though unequal, provided stability within the harsh landscapes. Jarls commanded fleets and wars, carls tilled the land and manned the oars, and thralls bore the burdens that others could not or would not. Together they formed a culture that valued strength, independence, and loyalty, bound by both necessity and tradition. Out of this structure emerged the warriors and leaders who would carry their people far beyond their fjords and forests, seeking fortune where the land alone could not provide. The morning of June 8th in the year 793 broke clear and calm over the tidal island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria. Monks moved quietly through their routines, tending to manuscripts, offering prayers, and preparing meals for pilgrims who had travelled to this sacred place. The monastery stood as a beacon of Christianity in the north, holding relics, illuminated texts, and treasures accumulated through years of royal patronage. Its location, connected to the mainland only at low tide, gave the impression of safety. The monks could not know that this day would mark the opening of a new age of terror and transformation. On the horizon, sails appeared, square, dark against the lightening sky. As the vessels drew closer, carved dragon heads could be seen rising from their prows, their eyes painted in fierce patterns that seemed to writhe with the movement of waves. These were not traders, they were warriors, their ships built for speed, their crews honed by years of hardship and training. The longships slid effortlessly onto the sandy shore, shallow drafts allowing them to land directly on the beach. Warriors leapt into the surf with practiced discipline, shields at their sides, weapons in hand. The monastery had no walls fit to resist them. The monks, unarmed and untrained in war, faced men in helmets reinforced with iron, their leather armor studded with plates, their shields painted in bright colors. The raiders carried spears, axes, and the long knives called sea axes, while some bore swords, weapons so costly that they revealed the wealth of their owners. These men moved with precision, spreading through the monastery's buildings, breaking doors and seizing treasures. Golden chalices, silver reliquaries, jeweled crosses, all were stripped from altars and tables. Illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly created over decades, were torn from shelves, destined to be traded in distant markets. The monks themselves suffered grievously. Some were cut down in their own cloisters, their blood staining the stone floors of churches once thought untouchable. Others were bound and dragged to the ships, destined for slavery in markets from Dublin to Kiev. The few who escaped fled inland, carrying tales of horror that would spread through all of Christendom. For the monks, the invaders were not merely enemies of flesh and blood, but forces of chaos, pagans who seemed to mock the sanctity of their faith. The shock reverberated swiftly. Letters from Alcuin of York, advisor to Charlemagne, expressed disbelief that such a sacred place had been violated. Chroniclers wrote with sorrow and outrage, declaring that never before had such terror come upon Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event in grim simplicity, yet the starkness of its words carried weight. Heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through rapine and slaughter. To the Christian world, this was more than an attack. It was a wound upon the order of existence, for the monastery had seemed protected not only by isolation, but by divine power. The choice of Lindisfarne revealed the raiders' intelligence and cunning. The monastery was wealthy but unguarded, positioned where ships could land quickly, and too isolated for reinforcements to arrive in time. The timing, early summer, reflected not randomness but planning, when sailing conditions were favorable and harvests in the homeland allowed warriors to leave. These were not desperate marauders striking blindly. They were disciplined men guided by leaders who recognized opportunity. For the people of England, the raid shattered assumptions of safety. If an island monastery could fall, then no coast was secure. The raiders seemed to come from nowhere, striking suddenly and vanishing before organized resistance could be mustered. Their ships gave them mobility unlike any other force of the time. To defenders, it felt as if the sea itself had birthed these pagans, immune to Christian prayers and holy relics. Fear magnified their reputation, giving them an aura of supernatural ferocity that spread even faster than their sails. The Lindisfarne raid was not the first time Scandinavian warriors had travelled abroad, nor would it be the last, but it marked a moment when the wider world could no longer ignore them. The monastery's treasures became plunder, its monks became captives, and its sacred halls were left in ruins. This act signaled the beginning of what history would call the Viking Age, when the people shaped by fjords, forests and winters would project their strength across Europe and beyond. In the years that followed, other raids struck Ireland, Scotland, and the coasts of Francia, each repeating the pattern set at Lindisfarne: swift arrival, merciless looting, and sudden departure. Yet it was this first blow that resounded most deeply, for it came without precedent and without warning. From this day forward, Europe would live with the knowledge that the sea could deliver not only traders but destroyers, men who feared neither holy ground nor holy men. The terror born that morning became a legend, retold with awe and dread across generations. To the raiders, it was proof that their ships and weapons could open any door, no matter how sacred. To their victims, it was the beginning of an age when the North had turned its gaze outward, bringing with it fire and steel. The pattern established at Lindisfarne soon repeated itself, echoing across the waters of the British Isles. In 795 the raiders appeared again, this time striking the monastery on Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland. Like Lindisfarne, the settlement was sacred, wealthy, and vulnerable. The monks had no defences against men who leapt from long ships with weapons ready and discipline honed by years of hardship at sea. Treasures of gold and silver, manuscripts and captives were seized, while the sanctity of the monastery offered no protection from blades or fire. The same year saw attacks on Iona, the holy island founded by St. Columba, long a spiritual heart of Celtic Christianity. Here the raiders struck with equal ferocity, looting relics and scattering the community. They returned again in 802 and 806, the latter raid leaving nearly 70 monks dead, their bodies lying among the stone ruins that had once echoed with chants and prayers. The survivors carried St. Columba's relics inland to Kells, seeking safety far from the reach of dragon-prowed ships. The destruction of Iona sent shockwaves throughout Ireland and Scotland, demonstrating that no place, however sacred, could escape the longships. In these early years, the targets were carefully chosen. Wealth concentrated in monasteries made them irresistible, for they held not only silver and gold, but also finely wrought chalices, crosses, and reliquaries crafted with artistry, valued far beyond spiritual devotion. Monasteries also held captives of high ransom value, learned monks, sons of noble families, or pilgrims caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. These individuals could be sold in markets from Dublin to Scandinavia, traded like coin for silver and goods. For the raiders, monasteries were banks unguarded, filled with treasures portable enough to carry aboard their ships. The raiders' tactics grew sharper with each expedition. They learned to exploit religious festivals when churches and monasteries swelled with pilgrims bearing offerings. They struck in summer months, when seas were favorable and when defenders least expected war. Their landings were swift, their coordination precise. Once ashore, they divided into groups, plundering with speed before resistance could be raised. Specialized tools accompanied them, crafted to break into storerooms or pry treasures from altars. Their discipline ensured that within hours they could strip a site of wealth and vanish back into the waves. Ireland's coasts became frequent targets, not only because of monasteries, but also because of its abundance of rivers and inlets. Longships could slide up estuaries and deep into the land, raiding settlements thought secure from seaborne threat. The Irish annals record repeated assaults, their entries filled with lament and fury. What began as sporadic attacks grew into yearly events, until the rhythm of the raiding season became as predictable as harvest. Villages near the shore lived in constant vigilance, watching horizons where sails might appear at any time. Scotland, too, bore the brunt of these incursions. Monasteries on its western isles were struck again and again. Communities that had long believed their isolation was protection found it to be their undoing. The very remoteness that had preserved their spiritual life made them vulnerable to enemies who thrived on the sea. Over time, many such communities abandoned their island homes, retreating inland where longships could not follow. The relocation of sacred relics inland symbolized the failure of geography and faith alike to protect them from the new menace. The psychological impact of these raids was profound. For Christian Europe, the desecration of holy sites seemed to reveal divine abandonment. Prayers and relics that had once shielded communities proved powerless. The raiders, with their fierce cries, painted shields, and disregard for sacred space, seemed touched by some darker power. Chroniclers wrote of them not as mere men, but as scourges sent to punish or test the faithful. In this fear, their reputation grew, magnified beyond their numbers, until the sight of a single sail could cause panic across miles of coastline. For the raiders themselves, these expeditions proved that fortune favored their daring. ships returned home laden with wealth, silver coins, golden vessels, exotic cloths, and human captives. Such rewards fueled ambition, drawing more men into the ranks of warriors eager for their share. Chiefs who organized raids rose in prestige, their generosity in distributing loot cementing their authority. Success bred larger expeditions, each building on the last, until raiding became not a rare act, but a way of life. The raids into Ireland and Scotland also marked the beginning of longer stays abroad. At first, the raiders came and went within a season, returning home with their plunder. Yet the abundance of targets encouraged some to remain for months, establishing temporary camps from which to launch repeated strikes. In time, these footholds would grow into permanent settlements, altering the political and cultural landscape of the islands themselves. By the dawn of the 9th century, the terror that began at Lindisfarne had spread widely. Monasteries burned, holy relics were scattered, and the cries of captives echoed in foreign markets. The raiders had discovered a strategy both profitable and sustainable, and they pursued it with relentless energy. For the communities of Ireland and Scotland, a new reality had taken hold. The sea, once a source of trade and connection, had become a pathway for destruction. The men who leapt from the decks of longships carried more than speed and surprise with them. They bore weapons that embodied both utility and symbolism, tools of war that had evolved alongside their culture. The axe, simple yet devastating, was perhaps the most iconic. Some were small, one-handed weapons suited for swift strikes in close combat, while others were broad-bladed, capable of cleaving shields and armor. These axes were not always crude. Many were balanced, carefully forged, and decorated with patterns that testified to the pride of their owners. In battle, the glint of such blades was a terror in itself, for a single stroke could split helmet and skull alike. The sword held a different place in their arsenal. More costly than axes or spears, a sword marked wealth and status. To own one was to stand apart, for each required skill and labor, from smiths who folded and welded steel into strong, flexible blades. The hilts were often adorned with precious metals or intricate designs, making the weapon not only deadly but beautiful. A sword was a symbol of lineage, sometimes passed down through generations, imbued with the deeds of those who had wielded it before. In the hand of a seasoned warrior, it became an extension of honor and identity, as much a mark of nobility as any crown or cloak. Spears, however, were the most common weapons, versatile in both defense and attack. They could be thrust in tight formations, hurled across distances, or used to hold enemies at bay. A spear required less wealth to fashion than a sword and less strength than a heavy axe, making it accessible to warriors of many ranks. Shields, round and often painted, completed the armament. Constructed from planks of wood rimmed with iron and centered with a boss, they provided both defense and offense. In combat, shields overlapped to form walls of wood and steel, a barrier that advanced step by step, turning individuals into a unified force. The seax, a long knife, was nearly universal. It served as both a weapon and a tool, useful in daily tasks yet deadly when pressed into combat. Worn at the belt, it was always within reach, a constant reminder that a Viking was never without arms. Armor varied. Some warriors wore helmets shaped with nose guards, while others relied on simple leather or quilted garments. Mail was rare, costly, and reserved for those of higher status, but its presence on the battlefield marked a warrior as formidable. The majority fought with little more than courage, shields, and the natural resilience of men hardened by labor and cold. Yet their greatest weapon was not steel, but fear. The suddenness of their arrival, the swiftness of their strikes, and their disregard for sanctity instilled terror out of proportion to their numbers. Villagers who had never seen such men before imagined them as demons or monsters. Tales of their ferocity spread faster than their ships, magnifying their power through rumor. This psychological edge meant that resistance often crumbled before battle was even joined. A single dragon-headed prow on the horizon could send whole communities fleeing, leaving behind undefended treasures. Stories of berserkers added to this aura of dread. These warriors, whether myth or reality, were said to fight in frenzied states, howling like wolves, biting their shields and striking with superhuman strength. Accounts describe them as immune to pain, continuing to fight even when wounded, their frenzy only ending in exhaustion or death. Whether fueled by substances, ritual, or sheer will, the legend of the berserker served to heighten fear. To face a man who seemed possessed by gods or spirits was to confront not just an enemy, but an embodiment of chaos itself. Tactics reinforced this terror. Viking raiders avoided drawn-out battles whenever possible. They preferred lightning strikes where speed and surprise overwhelmed opponents before defenses could be raised. Longships enabled them to land at dawn or dusk, to vanish upriver, or to retreat into open sea before an enemy could gather. When resistance arose, they exploited weak points, feigned retreats, and struck flanks, using maneuverability to offset their smaller numbers. Against heavily armored knights or fortified towns, they relied on mobility rather than brute force, choosing targets that could be taken swiftly rather than besieging strongholds. Even their appearance contributed to intimidation. Warriors bore hair braided or loose, beards thick and unkempt, their clothing dyed in bright colors that set them apart from the muted hues of their victims. Shields painted with spirals or beasts created the impression of a wall alive with movement. Some may have darkened their eyes with kohl, adding to the ferocity of their gaze. To people unaccustomed to such sights, these details seemed almost otherworldly, feeding the sense that the invaders were touched by powers beyond the human realm. Plunder was not their only aim. Captives, often women and children, were seized in large numbers. These became thralls, carried back to Scandinavia or sold in markets abroad. The prospect of enslavement added to the terror of raids, for even survival did not guarantee freedom. Communities that resisted risked massacre. Those that surrendered still faced the theft of their people. This dual threat, death or slavery, undermined morale, leaving many to flee rather than fight. Through a blend of weaponry, discipline, and psychological dominance, the raiders carved out a reputation that would precede them wherever they sailed. Even kings and nobles spoke of them with dread, their letters filled with pleas for divine protection. The weapons they carried were deadly, but the fear they inspired was more enduring, shaping how entire nations responded to their presence. The rivers of Francia opened a new stage for the raiders, carrying them deep into the heart of one of Europe's greatest kingdoms. The Carolingian Empire, vast though it was, proved vulnerable to the mobility of longships. Unlike the open coasts of Britain and Ireland, Francia possessed great rivers, the Seine, Loire, Garonne, and Rhine, that threaded through fertile lands rich with monasteries, towns, and trading centers. These waterways, once lifelines of commerce, became avenues of terror. Longships glided silently at dawn, their shallow drafts allowing them to bypass shoals and sandbars, and within hours they could deposit armed men at the gates of wealthy communities far from the sea. By the mid-9th century, raiders had established a pattern of striking Francia with increasing boldness. In 845, under the leadership of a chieftain named Ragnar, whose name would echo in sagas and chronicles alike, they launched an assault on Paris itself. Their fleet, said to number more than 100 ships, sailed up the Seine, spreading fear as they advanced. Towns along the river fell in succession, unable to withstand the sudden fury of dragon-prowed vessels disgorging warriors. Panic spread ahead of them, and when Paris came into view, the scale of the threat became undeniable. The defenders of the city attempted resistance, but the attackers struck with precision and ferocity. Churches and monasteries were looted, inhabitants slain or captured. The defenders struggled to hold their ground, but the invaders' mobility allowed them to attack where defenses were weakest. Chronicles record that they devastated the city, plundering wealth and spreading fire. King Charles the Bald, unable to marshal sufficient force to drive them away, resorted to negotiation. A tribute of £7,000 of silver was paid to secure their departure, a sum that revealed both the desperation of the Franks and the profitability of such expeditions. This was not an isolated incident. Again and again Viking fleets returned, each time exploiting the very rivers that had made Francia prosperous. In 851 they sailed the Seine once more, raiding Rouen and the surrounding countryside. By 858 they had penetrated the Loire Valley, devastating Tours and Orléans. Monasteries such as Saint-Denis, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and countless others fell victim, their treasures carried back to Scandinavia or sold in distant markets. For the Franks, the devastation was compounded by the sense that their wealth, once a symbol of divine favor, had become a lure for pagans who seemed immune to Christian power. The tactics employed in these raids displayed a keen understanding of both geography and psychology. The raiders struck quickly, avoided prolonged sieges, and retreated before royal armies could assemble. When resistance stiffened, they adapted, building fortified camps along riversides from which they launched repeated assaults. These bases, sometimes occupied for months, allowed them to control regions with astonishing effectiveness. The very mobility of their ships meant they could abandon one base and establish another in a matter of days, leaving defenders uncertain where the next blow would fall. The Carolingian rulers, beset by internal divisions and succession disputes, found themselves ill-prepared to counter such fluid warfare. Tribute became a frequent response, with silver and goods offered in exchange for peace that rarely lasted. Each payment emboldened the raiders, confirming that persistence would yield rewards greater than any single raid could provide. The chroniclers of the time recorded these humiliations with bitterness, noting how the wealth of the realm was poured into the hands of its enemies. Yet not all responses were passive. Some Frankish leaders attempted to build fortified bridges across rivers, blocking longships and restricting their movement. These efforts met with mixed success. At times, the raiders were forced to withdraw or find new routes. At others, they simply bypassed the obstacles or dismantled them with fire and steel. The constant adaptation of both sides turned the rivers of Francia into contested frontiers, where innovation in defense and offense developed rapidly. The cultural impact of these raids was immense. Churches rebuilt after destruction became symbols of resilience, yet their repeated burning underscored vulnerability. Communities fled from riverbanks to inland hills, altering settlement patterns. Songs, prayers, and laments filled chronicles, depicting the raiders as scourges sent by divine will to punish sin. To the Franks, the invaders were not only pagans, but instruments of chaos, their very presence a disruption of the divine order upon which the empire rested. For the raiders, however, the campaigns in Francia revealed the extraordinary potential of organized fleets. Wealth poured into their homelands, funding further expeditions, strengthening chiefs, and fueling rivalries. The rivers that once carried grain and wine now bore treasures and slaves toward the north. The daring of Ragnar and others who followed him established a precedent. No city, however great, was beyond reach. By the close of the 9th century, the Seine, Loire, and Garonne were etched into memory not as arteries of prosperity, but as scars of invasion. The Carolingian world, stretched thin and fractured by its own struggles, learned that the horizon carried not only merchants, but marauders who could humble kings. The raids upon Francia marked not just plunder, but a new phase of ambition where Viking power grew bold enough to challenge kingdoms at their very centres. The raids that scarred the coasts of Britain, Ireland and Francia were only the prelude to something larger. By the middle of the 9th century, the scale of Viking operations had shifted from lightning strikes to full-scale invasions. No longer were they content with monasteries and towns. They sought land, tribute, and permanent control. This transformation culminated in the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in England in 865, a force so formidable that it altered the political map of the island for generations. Unlike earlier raiding parties of a few ships, this was a coalition of many leaders united under a shared ambition. Saga tradition remembers its commanders as the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan and Ubba, though chronicles of the time speak more generally of Viking leaders. What is certain is that they commanded hundreds, perhaps thousands, of warriors, supported by fleets capable of transporting entire communities. Families came with them, bringing not only weapons but also livestock, tools, and the intention to remain. This was not a raid but a migration under arms. Their first target was East Anglia. Rather than attempting immediate conquest, they accepted tribute in exchange for peace, using the resources gained to strengthen their position. Horses were provided, giving them mobility across the land equal to their advantage at sea. From there they turned north, striking into Northumbria, a kingdom weakened by civil war between rival claimants to its throne. In 866 they captured York, the great city at the heart of the kingdom, taking advantage of disorder and striking with ruthless efficiency. Northumbria's kings fell, and the city became a Viking stronghold, its walls now manned by men who had crossed seas to claim it. The fall of York marked a turning point. This was not a fleeting victory, but the establishment of a base from which to launch further campaigns. From their new seat of power, the invaders could control trade routes, command surrounding lands, and attract reinforcements from across the sea. Northumbria's fate demonstrated that even kingdoms could be overthrown, not just villages and monasteries. The shock reverberated across England, forcing neighbouring rulers to confront a threat unlike any they had faced before. In 869, the Great Army turned upon East Anglia, the very kingdom that had once bought peace with tribute. King Edmund resisted, refusing to renounce his faith or submit. He was captured and executed, remembered in chronicles as a martyr who met death with unshaken devotion. His death became a symbol of resistance, but his kingdom was absorbed into Viking control, its lands divided among warriors. With Northumbria and East Anglia subdued, the Great Army turned toward Mercia, a once mighty kingdom now forced into submission and tribute. The tactics of the Great Army combined mobility with relentless pressure. They fortified captured towns, using them as bases to winter and regroup, something earlier raiders had rarely attempted. Their presence was no longer seasonal, it was constant, pressing into the fabric of English politics. Local rulers faced a choice between paying tribute, forming uneasy alliances, or risking destruction. The very landscape of England began to shift as Viking settlements took root, carving out what would come to be known as the Danelaw. The arrival of such a force revealed the evolution of Viking ambition. Raids had brought wealth, but conquest promised permanence. Land was more than treasure, it was sustenance, stability, and a foundation for future generations. For warriors weary of constant voyages, England's fertile fields offered what the rocky soils of Scandinavia could not. Towns and monasteries provided both resources and bases for integration into local economies. The Great Army's actions foreshadowed the blending of cultures that would emerge in centuries to come. English resistance was fragmented. Some rulers capitulated quickly, while others attempted defiance, but lacked the strength to withstand prolonged assault. The sheer size of the Great Army allowed it to strike in multiple directions, forcing opponents into reactive positions. Where tribute was offered, it was accepted and used to finance further campaigns. Where defiance was shown, the army descended with overwhelming force, crushing resistance and leaving no doubt of its determination. The chronicles of the time spoke of them with dread, describing them as a tide that rolled over kingdoms. To the Anglo-Saxons, it seemed as though the wrath of pagan gods had been unleashed upon them. Yet behind the fear lay a practical reality. The great army was disciplined, organized, and guided by leaders who understood both war and politics. They did not merely destroy, they occupied, negotiated, and adapted, laying down structures of control that would endure. By the early 870s, much of England lay under their shadow. Only Wessex, the kingdom in the south, remained as a stronghold of resistance. The stage was set for conflict that would determine the future of the island, with Alfred, a young prince of Wessex, rising to face the challenge. For now, however, the great army stood triumphant, its banners flying over conquered lands, its warriors settling into homes they had claimed through steel and fire. The advance of the great heathen army seemed unstoppable as the 9th century pressed forward. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen, Northumbria shattered, East Anglia consumed, Mercia weakened to a tributary state. Yet in the south lay Wessex, the last bulwark of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Here, a young prince named Alfred, son of Ethelwulf, would step forward, and through resilience and cunning alter the course of history. When the Vikings turned their gaze upon Wessex in 871, Alfred had only recently ascended to the throne after the death of his brother, King Ethelred. His baptism into kingship was immediate and violent. The great army descended with its full might, driving deep into Wessex's heartland. A series of fierce battles unfolded, remembered as the year of 9 engagements. Though Alfred and his forces fought bravely, the pressure was immense, and Wessex seemed close to breaking under the weight of the invaders' relentless assaults. Alfred was forced to pay tribute, securing a fragile peace. Yet, unlike other kingdoms, Wessex did not collapse. Alfred used the reprieve to reorganize, strengthening his military forces, refining defenses, and preparing for the inevitable return. His vision extended beyond mere survival. He sought a way to counter the mobility and endurance of the Viking threat. The storm broke in 878 when the Viking leader Guthrum launched a sudden midwinter attack, seizing Chippenham and driving Alfred into the marshes of Somerset. For many, it seemed the end had come. Yet in those marshes, Alfred did not surrender. He gathered loyal followers, striking out with guerrilla tactics, harassing the enemy and refusing to yield. Stories later embroidered this period with legend, telling of the king disguised among peasants, of patience tested and endurance proven. Whether myth or truth, what mattered was that Alfred held fast when others might have fled. In the spring, he summoned his forces, gathering fyrds from across the shires, the militia of free men bound to defend their land. At Edington, he met Guthrum's army in open battle. The clash was fierce, shield walls grinding together, axes and spears clashing in thunderous rhythm, but Alfred's forces, hardened by desperation and unified by necessity, stood firm. When the Viking line broke, pursuit was relentless, driving Guthrum's men back and surrounding them. The victory at Edington was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a turning point. Guthrum and his warriors, trapped and outmatched, were forced to sue for peace. Alfred demanded more than tribute. He required Guthrum to accept baptism, symbolically submitting to the Christian order that the Vikings had so long defied. The Treaty of Wedmore followed, dividing England into spheres of influence. The north and east became the Danelaw under Viking control, while Wessex and the south remained Anglo-Saxon. For the first time, a boundary had been drawn that recognized both Viking conquest and Anglo-Saxon survival. Alfred's victory reshaped the struggle. The great army was not annihilated, but its momentum had been broken. Where once it seemed that all of England would fall, now a line of defence had been established. Alfred used this breathing space to fortify his kingdom. He ordered the construction of burhs, fortified towns strategically placed to resist attack and provide refuge for surrounding populations. He reorganized the military system, ensuring that part of the fyrd was always on duty while the rest tended to their fields, preventing exhaustion and desertion. These reforms transformed Wessex into a realm resilient against the sudden strikes that had devastated other kingdoms. Beyond war, Alfred also turned to learning and culture. He sought to strengthen his people not only with swords, but with knowledge, translating Latin works into Old English, encouraging literacy, and fostering a sense of shared identity. In doing so, he laid the foundations for a future where the English would see themselves not as scattered kingdoms, but as one people bound together. The Treaty of Wedmore did not end conflict. Raids and battles continued, and the Danelaw remained a region of tension where Norse and Saxon laws coexisted uneasily. Yet Alfred's survival and reforms ensured that England would not be erased. Instead, the struggle became one of balance, with two cultures shaping the destiny of the island together. To the Anglo-Saxons, Alfred became a figure of hope, remembered as the Great, a title few would earn. To the Vikings, he was a foe unlike any other, one who could not be broken by terror or fire. His endurance in the marshes, his victory at Edington, and his vision for Wessex marked a turning of the tide. The great army had conquered much, but in Alfred they had met their match, a leader who refused to let the storm consume his land. With England divided between the Danelaw and the realm of Wessex, the restless energy of the north sought horizons further still. The sea had always been both boundary and opportunity, and now it opened the way to new lands. To the west, beyond the familiar coasts of Britain and Ireland, lay untouched islands that promised grazing pastures, fishing grounds, and freedom from the pressures of crowded valleys and contested kingdoms. It was in this spirit of exploration and necessity that Scandinavian voyagers turned toward the North Atlantic, beginning with the settlement of Iceland. The earliest Norsemen to reach Iceland may have been accidental travellers, blown off course while sailing between Norway and the British Isles. Some accounts tell of Irish monks who had dwelled there earlier in hermitage, seeking solitude in barren landscapes. Yet it was the Norse who made the island their own, drawn by its resources and its promise of independence. In the latter part of the 9th century, ships began to arrive deliberately, carrying families, livestock, and tools. The land, volcanic and rugged, offered fertile valleys along its coasts, rivers teeming with fish, and abundant grazing for sheep and cattle. The settlement of Iceland was not merely migration, it was a social experiment. Many of those who departed Norway did so under pressure from King Harald Fairhair, whose unification of the realm drove rival chieftains and ambitious farmers to seek freedom elsewhere. Rather than submit to centralized rule, they sailed westward, choosing the uncertainties of a new land over the control of a king. This spirit of independence shaped the society that developed there, one less bound by monarchy and more reliant on collective governance. Land-taking was an organized process. Arrivals claimed coastal strips, marking boundaries with cairns and stakes. Families spread inland from the fjords, establishing farmsteads that became the nuclei of future communities. Unlike in Scandinavia, where estates could be vast and hierarchical, Iceland's geography encouraged a more even distribution. Most settlers acquired enough land to sustain themselves, fostering a society of relatively independent farmers rather than rigid classes of lords and peasants. Wealth still varied, but the gap between great and small was narrower than in the homelands they had left behind. The environment demanded adaptation. Winters were harsh, though milder than those of Norway. and volcanic soils proved fertile in valleys where barley and hay could be grown. Livestock became central, especially sheep, whose wool provided both clothing and trade goods. Fishing supplemented the diet, and seals were hunted along rocky coasts. Yet survival required careful planning, for mistakes in storing fodder or managing herds could mean disaster. Communities learned to rely on cooperation as much as independence, exchanging goods, labor, and protection. Out of this new society arose a unique form of governance, the Althing. Established around 930, it was a general assembly where chieftains and free men gathered to decide disputes, codify laws, and affirm social order. Unlike monarchies elsewhere in Europe, Iceland operated without a king. Authority rested in law and custom, recited by a law speaker who preserved tradition in memory. The Althing became not only a political forum, but a cultural one, where alliances were forged, marriages arranged, and sagas recited. It embodied the values that had driven settlers westward, a rejection of tyranny, an embrace of shared responsibility, and the belief that community could govern itself. The sagas remembered this land-taking as a heroic age, filled with stories of bold explorers and proud families. Men such as Ingolfur Arnarson, said to be the first permanent settler, became symbols of the courage required to carve life from wilderness. These tales blended history with legend, preserving the spirit of independence and resilience that defined the island's people. While isolation preserved their autonomy, it also tied Icelanders to the wider Viking world. Ships sailed regularly to Norway, Britain, and beyond, trading wool, fish, and hides for iron, timber, and luxuries unavailable on the island. Though remote, Iceland was never cut off. It was a node in the expanding network of Norse exploration and commerce. Its people heard of distant events, participated in raids and trade, and contributed to the cultural richness of the Viking Age. The settlement of Iceland demonstrated the dual nature of Norse expansion. It was not only about plunder and conquest, but also about migration, adaptation, and the search for new homes. Here, on the edge of the known world, a society arose that valued law, storytelling, and independence as much as war and raiding. The challenges of the land forged a community resilient in hardship, creative in governance, and enduring in memory. Life in Iceland, though secured by the courage of settlers and the abundance of new land, remained a constant negotiation with hardship. The island's volcanic soil could yield crops, but only in limited areas, and the winters pressed heavily upon both people and livestock. Sheep became the backbone of survival, their wool spun into garments and sails, their meat salted and dried for sustenance, their milk turned into butter and cheese. Cattle, though prized, were harder to sustain through the cold months, for they required vast stores of hay. Fish filled the gaps, pulled from rivers and coasts, while seabirds and seals offered additional food when supplies dwindled. Each household lived in awareness that a poor harvest or a harsh winter could bring ruin. The houses that dotted the valleys reflected the pragmatism of this new society. Turf walls, thick and insulating, kept out the worst of the wind and snow. Roofs were layered with sod, blending into the landscape, while smoke holes allowed hearth fires to burn throughout the long winters. Within these halls, families gathered closely, sharing warmth and labor. Women wove endlessly at looms, producing the cloth that clothed the community and served as a form of currency. Men tended animals, repaired tools, and carved wood into vessels, handles, and implements. Survival was the first priority, yet even in such practical routines there was space for artistry and expression. The Althing, established early in the settlement, became the soul of Icelandic society. Unlike in lands ruled by kings, here decisions arose from collective voice. Each summer, chieftains, farmers, and free men gathered at Thingvellir, a broad plain beside a dramatic rift valley. Beneath the open sky, disputes were argued, laws recited, and verdicts pronounced. The law speaker, chosen for his memory and eloquence, stood before the assembly to recite the statutes, for the law lived not in books, but in voices. Justice took the form of compensation, outlawry, or exile, ensuring balance in a society where endless vengeance could destroy fragile stability. This system encouraged a culture of negotiation, eloquence, and storytelling. Arguments were sharpened by wit as much as by force, and reputation grew from the ability to persuade as well as to fight. Alliances were forged through marriages arranged at the Althing, while feasts bound families together across regions. In these gatherings, the values of independence and equality were reinforced, for every free man had a voice, and no king could impose his will above the law. The sagas, preserved first through oral tradition and later written in Iceland centuries afterward, emerged from this environment. They told of the land-taking, of the feuds and alliances that shaped families, of honor upheld and betrayed. Heroes and villains alike were rendered with detail, their deeds remembered not only for entertainment, but for guidance. In a society without centralized authority, sagas preserved shared memory, teaching lessons of justice, endurance, and the cost of pride. Skaldic poets composed intricate verses that praised chieftains, recounted battles, and honored ancestors, weaving myth and history into a single tapestry. Cultural identity flourished in this balance between hardship and creativity. The people who endured long winters in turf houses also carried with them a rich heritage of mythology and legend. Even as Christianity slowly reached the island in later centuries, the older traditions of gods, giants, and spirits remained alive in stories. Runes carved into stones or wooden beams carried protective charms, while rituals at seasonal festivals honored both old deities and the cycles of nature. Belief was practical and poetic alike, rooted in the needs of survival yet open to the grandeur of cosmic struggle. Though isolated, Iceland was never fully cut off from the wider Norse world. Ships carried goods and news back and forth to Norway, the British Isles, and beyond. Traders and adventurers from Iceland joined expeditions across Europe, bringing back silver, weapons, and tales of distant lands. Yet, unlike other Viking outposts, Iceland was not primarily a base for raiding. It was a homeland, a place where people sought permanence and autonomy, carving order out of volcanic rock and icy seas. The Icelandic experiment was unique, a society of farmers and warriors who rejected kingship, who codified their lives in lore and story, and who saw survival as both labor and art. Out of this experiment arose one of the most remarkable cultural legacies of the Viking Age, where sagas and laws preserved voices that would echo far beyond the island's shores. Exile was one of the harshest punishments a Norseman could face. To be cast out from community meant not only the loss of protection and kinship, but also the need to carve a new life in lands unknown. It was through exile that Eric the Red came to discover and settle Greenland, carrying the Viking spirit of exploration even further into the Atlantic. Eric's story began in Norway, but violence marked his path early. His father, Thorvald, was outlawed for manslaughter and forced to leave for Iceland. There, Eric grew to manhood, but blood again followed his steps. After a series of disputes that turned deadly, Eric himself was declared an outlaw around 982. For 3 years he was forbidden from Iceland, a sentence that pushed him westward across uncharted seas. Stories told of land glimpsed by earlier sailors blown off course, barren yet real, lying beyond the horizon. Eric gathered his men and sailed in search of it, choosing exile as opportunity rather than defeat. What he found was a vast and rugged coast where glaciers tumbled into the sea and mountains rose stark against the sky. Yet along the southern fjords lay pockets of green, fertile enough for grazing and farming. Cunningly, he named the place Greenland, believing that a hopeful name would draw settlers to its shores. His vision was not only survival, but the creation of a new community, one where exiles and adventurers alike could begin anew, free of old enmities and crowded lands. When Eric's term of exile ended, he returned to Iceland to spread word of his discovery. His tales spoke not of glaciers and peril, but of meadows and fertile ground. The promise of land drew many who sought independence or escape from feuds. Around 985, Eric led a fleet of some 25 ships across the ocean. Not all survived the journey, storms scattered and sank several, but enough arrived to establish the foundations of settlement. 2 colonies emerged, known as the Eastern and Western settlements, nestled in fjords where grass grew and seas offered fish and seals. Life in Greenland was harsher than in Iceland. The growing season was shorter, the soil thinner, and the winters longer. Yet settlers adapted, focusing on livestock rather than crops. Sheep, goats, and cattle grazed in summer pastures, their fodder carefully stored for the frozen months. Hunting became vital. Seals provided both meat and skins, caribou offered hides and sinew, and the great walrus became a cornerstone of survival. Walrus ivory, in particular, proved valuable, traded across Europe for silver, cloth, and goods. It was this trade that sustained the colonies, linking their remote fjords to the broader Viking world. The settlements, though small, carried with them the institutions of Norse life. Farms clustered along the fjords, each family striving for independence, yet bound together by necessity. Assemblies mirrored the Althing of Iceland, with laws upheld and disputes settled through negotiation. Churches rose as Christianity reached Greenland, blending old traditions with the new faith. Even here, on the edge of the habitable world, sagas and poetry were recited, ensuring that culture survived alongside survival. But the challenges were relentless. Sea ice could block ships for seasons, cutting Greenland off from trade. Storms made voyages perilous, and famine always loomed if hunts failed or stores ran low. Exile had driven Eric to Greenland, yet it was courage and stubbornness that allowed the settlements to endure. Eric himself became a figure of legend, remembered both for his fiery temper and his role as a founder. His descendants, including his son Leif, would carry the spirit of exploration even further, across seas no Norseman had yet conquered. The settlement of Greenland showed both the extremes of Norse adaptability and the limits of their world. They had taken root in lands where survival seemed improbable, sustained by trade and ingenuity. Yet beneath their achievements lay fragility, for their lives depended on narrow fjords of grass amid a land of ice. Still, for a time, they thrived, proving once more that the people of the North could transform exile into opportunity, hardship into endurance, and barren coasts into homes. Leif Erikson grew up in Greenland, a land where survival demanded resilience and imagination. As the son of Eric the Red, he inherited both the legacy of exile and the spirit of adventure. Greenland had offered new beginnings, but its narrow valleys and short summers left little room for expansion. Hunters pushed further into the icy wilderness, traders relied on distant markets for survival, and stories circulated of lands yet farther west. It was within this context that Leif, guided by both curiosity and opportunity, undertook the voyage that would carry Norsemen to the shores of North America. Tales had already reached Greenland of land glimpsed by sailors blown off course. One such man, Bjarni Herjolfsson, had seen wooded coasts to the west while trying to reach Greenland, though he never set foot upon them. His story spread quickly, for trees were scarce in Greenland, and timber was among the most valuable of resources. Where Bjarni had passed by, Leif sought to land. Around the year 1000 he gathered a crew, secured a ship, and set sail across unknown waters, driven by both the promise of wealth and the restless inheritance of his lineage. The voyage brought Leif and his men first to a stony, barren land they called Helluland, the land of flat stones, likely the coast of modern-day Baffin Island. Here they found little to tempt them, for the soil was thin and the cold oppressive. Sailing further, they reached a forested land they named Markland, the land of woods, thought to be Labrador. The abundance of timber was enticing, yet Leif pressed on, seeking the place described in rumour where the land was richer still. At last they came to a place of milder climate, where wild grapes grew in abundance, where rivers teemed with salmon, and where meadows offered pasture. This they called Vinland, the land of wine. Modern scholars believe it lay in Newfoundland, perhaps at Lanceau Meadows, where traces of Norse settlement have been unearthed. For Leif and his companions, it was a land of promise, unlike anything in Greenland or Iceland. Here they built shelters, harvested grapes, cut timber, and prepared to winter. The sagas tell of encounters with native peoples whom the Norse called Skraelings. These first meetings were marked by curiosity and trade, but tensions soon escalated. The Norse offered red cloth, which the Skraelings prized, receiving furs and skins in return. Yet misunderstandings and fear led to violence, and the balance of power favoured the natives, whose numbers far exceeded those of the small Norse groups. Though the Norse fought fiercely, they realized that permanent settlement would be fraught with danger. Vinland was not abandoned without gain. Timber and other resources were carried back to Greenland, providing what the colonies desperately lacked. The very fact of its existence expanded Norse horizons, proving that the ocean carried not only peril, but also new worlds. Leif's voyage was celebrated in saga and story, his name carried into legend as the man who had gone farther west than any of his people before. Still, the attempt to colonize Vinland faltered. Successive expeditions followed, led by others of Eric's family, but none endured. The distance was great, the dangers many, and the numbers too few to maintain lasting settlements amid resistance from native inhabitants. After a handful of voyages, the Norse turned back, leaving behind only traces of their presence. For centuries, Vinland lived more in memory than in reality, a land spoken of in sagas, half legendary, half true. Yet even this fleeting contact carried significance. Long before Columbus, Norse sails had crossed to the shores of North America. Though they did not establish permanent colonies, their journeys demonstrated the reach of Viking seamanship and the audacity of their ambition. For a people who had begun in fjords and forests, who had pressed across Europe and into the Mediterranean, the discovery of Vinland marked the farthest expression of their restless spirit. The Greenlanders who heard Leif's tales understood both the promise and the peril. Vinland remained a land of plenty just out of reach, a dream tempered by the reality of their fragile settlements. For Leif, however, the voyage secured his place in history. He was remembered not only as Eric's son, but as the explorer who carried the Norse world to the edge of another continent, leaving behind a legacy of daring that would echo long after Greenland's colonies themselves had faded. As Norse sails carried men westward across the Atlantic, others turned their prows east, following rivers that wound through dense forests and vast plains. Here lay the routes that would connect Scandinavia not only with distant Slavic lands, but with the riches of Byzantium and the Islamic world. The warriors and traders who ventured along these waterways came to be known as Varangians, and their journeys eastward expanded the Viking Age into a new dimension of influence and power. The geography of Eastern Europe offered both challenge and opportunity. Great rivers such as the Neva, Volkhov, Dnieper, and Volga stretched like highways into the interior, linking the Baltic Sea to the Black and Caspian Seas. Longships, with their shallow drafts and sturdy hulls, proved perfectly suited to navigate these routes, gliding over broad waters and, when necessary, being dragged across portages to connect river systems. What had begun as small expeditions soon became established trade networks, drawing Norsemen deep into lands far from their rocky coasts. Along these rivers, the Norse encountered Slavic tribes, Finnic peoples, and steppe nomads. Trade became the foundation of their interactions. Furs, honey, wax, and slaves were carried downstream, exchanged for silver, silks, glassware, and spices from the south. Silver dirhams from the Islamic Caliphate poured into Scandinavia, thousands upon thousands of coins that fueled both wealth and rivalry in the north. Archaeologists uncovering hoards of dirhams in Sweden and Gotland testify to the scale of this commerce, revealing how deeply the Viking world was tied to distant economies. The Varangians did not remain mere visitors. They settled along the rivers, building fortified towns that became centers of control. Novgorod in the north emerged as a key hub, commanding trade routes and fostering alliances with local Slavs. Further south, Kiev rose to prominence, its location along the Dnieper making it a gateway to Byzantium. These settlements became the nuclei of what would grow into the Kievan Rus, a state born of both Norse and Slavic roots. Leadership emerged among the Varangians, figures remembered in chronicles that blended legend with history. Rurik, said to be invited by Slavic tribes to bring order to their disputes, established rule at Novgorod in the mid-9th century. His successors, Oleg and Igor, extended control southward, consolidating power along the river routes. By the early 10th century, Kiev had become the seat of authority, commanding trade, tribute, and military strength. The Norse element remained strong, but intermarriage and cultural blending soon wove Slavic traditions into the fabric of rule. The journey down the rivers was perilous. Rapids along the Dnieper threatened ships requiring crews to haul vessels overland or navigate treacherous currents. Bandits and rival tribes lay in wait, striking at convoys heavy with goods, yet the rewards outweighed the risks. At the end of the route lay Constantinople, the great city of Byzantium, where walls soared and markets overflowed with riches. For Norse traders and warriors, to reach the gates of Constantinople was to touch the very heart of wealth and civilization. The Byzantines recognized both the threat and the value of these newcomers. At times, fleets of Varangians appeared before the city, demanding tribute or access to trade. At others, treaties were negotiated, granting the Norse rights to market their goods in exchange for peace. Byzantine chroniclers described these tall, fair-haired warriors with awe, noting both their ferocity and their discipline. In time, some would enter the service of the empire itself, forging bonds that carried Viking influence into the very halls of imperial power. The expansion eastward reshaped the identity of the Norse. While raiders in the west were remembered as destroyers, those who moved along the rivers became traders, settlers, and rulers. Their axes and swords were still wielded, but increasingly alongside scales and weights. The Varangian routes opened not only markets, but avenues for cultural exchange, carrying Christian missionaries, Slavic traditions, and Byzantine artistry back toward the north. By the close of the 9th century, the Viking world stretched from Vinland in the west to Kiev in the east, a network of settlements and routes bound together by ships and ambition. The Varangians embodied the adaptability of their people, farmers at home, warriors in battle, merchants abroad, and rulers when opportunity allowed. Their presence in the east would not only shape their own destinies, but lay the foundations for new states whose legacy would endure long after the Viking Age itself had passed. The arrival of Rurik and his kin marked the beginning of something greater than a trading network. According to the primary chronicle, a compilation of early Russian history, Slavic tribes weary of constant feuds invited the Varangians to rule, believing that their strength could bring order. Whether the story is literal or symbolic, it reflects the merging of Norse and Slavic worlds. Rurik established his seat at Novgorod in the north, a stronghold along the Volkhov River, where he commanded both trade and tribute. His leadership laid the foundation for the dynasty that would become the rulers of Rus. Rurik's successors expanded his influence. Upon his death around 879, power passed to his kinsman Oleg, who proved both ambitious and cunning. Oleg moved southward, recognizing that control of the Dnieper River was the key to prosperity. By securing towns along the route, he ensured dominance over trade that linked the Baltic to the Black Sea. His greatest achievement came in 882 when he captured Kiev, a thriving settlement at the heart of river commerce. By making Kiev his capital, Oleg transformed a loose collection of trading posts into a unified state. From Kiev, Oleg projected both military and diplomatic power. He launched campaigns against neighboring tribes, extracting tribute and asserting authority. In 907, he famously led a fleet of longships to the walls of Constantinople itself. Byzantine chroniclers recorded with astonishment how the Norse dragged their ships on wheels across land to bypass defensive chains that barred the harbour. Whether every detail is accurate or not, the outcome was undeniable. Oleg forced the Byzantines to sign a treaty granting the Rus favourable trading rights. This treaty marked Rus not as mere raiders but as recognized players in international politics. The relationship between Rus and Byzantium grew complex. The Byzantines valued the furs, wax, and slaves that flowed down the rivers, and the Rus hungered for silver, silks, and wine. Yet there was always tension, for the Varangians remained warriors at heart. At times they attacked the empire, at others they swore oaths of loyalty and entered its service. This dual nature, traders one moment, conquerors the next, defined their interactions and kept the balance precarious. The structure of Rus society mirrored its origins. At the top stood princes of Norse descent, commanding both Varangian warriors and local Slavic levies. Around them clustered druzhina, bands of retainers bound by loyalty and reward, echoing the warbands of Scandinavia. Beneath them lived the Slavic farming communities, paying tribute in goods and labour. Over time, intermarriage and assimilation blurred the distinctions. Norse names mingled with Slavic ones, and Old Norse speech gave way to Slavic tongues. Yet traces of their origins remained, in place, names, in saga memory, and in the martial spirit of their rulers. Religion also marked a point of convergence. The Norse brought with them their gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, while the Slavs worshipped their own pantheon of spirits and deities. Pagan rituals persisted, tied to fertility, harvest, and war. But the influence of Byzantium introduced Christianity into the mix, carried by missionaries who travelled along the same trade routes as merchants. For the moment, paganism endured, yet seeds of change had been planted, foreshadowing a transformation that would come in later generations. The economic engine of Rus thrived on mobility. Caravans of longships moved south laden with furs from the northern forests, amber from the Baltic shores, and slaves captured in raids or taken as tribute. These goods found eager buyers in Constantinople and beyond. In return, Rus markets filled with Byzantine glass, silks from Asia, and silver dirhams minted in far-off Islamic lands. The wealth accumulated from this trade strengthened the rulers of Rus, enabling them to field armies, build fortifications, and maintain loyalty through gifts and payments. The rise of Rus under Rurik and Oleg demonstrated the adaptability of the Varangians. Where others raided and departed, they settled, assimilated, and ruled. Their ability to blend Norse ferocity with Slavic roots created a new identity, one that would evolve into a powerful state. By the dawn of the 10th century, Kiev stood as a beacon of this fusion, a city where Norse warriors, Slavic farmers, Byzantine traders, and steppe nomads all converged. It was a crossroads of cultures, forged by rivers and sustained by ambition. The transformation from wandering traders to rulers of Rus marked a new phase in the Viking Age. The same men who once struck monasteries now signed treaties with emperors. Their swords still gleamed, but their power now rested equally on diplomacy and commerce. The legacy of Rurik and Oleg would endure long after the Viking Age ended, for out of their leadership emerged a state that would carry the memory of Varangians into the chronicles of both Russia and Europe. The lure of Byzantium remained irresistible to the men of the north. Constantinople, the queen of cities, shone as a beacon of wealth and majesty, its towering walls, golden domes, and bustling markets unlike anything seen in the forests and fjords of the north. For the Varangians who had settled along the rivers of Rus, the city represented both a rival and an opportunity. Some arrived as raiders, but others found their way into its very heart as sworn protectors. Out of this unlikely bond emerged the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of warriors who became legendary for their loyalty and ferocity. The Byzantines were cautious in their dealings with the Rus. They had faced their fleets at their gates and knew the havoc they could unleash. Yet they also recognized the value of these warriors, whose strength and fearlessness could serve the empire if properly harnessed. By the mid-10th century, treaties between Rus princes and the Byzantine emperors included provisions for military service. Norse warriors who once battered at the walls of Constantinople now stood upon them, bearing arms in defense of the very empire they had once threatened. The Varangian Guard was not composed solely of Norsemen, yet it was the Norse element that gave it its character in its earliest days. Towering figures, fair-haired and broad-shouldered, armed with great two-handed axes, they impressed all who saw them. Chroniclers described them as unflinching in battle, their axes capable of cleaving through armor and shield alike. To stand against them was to face a wall of relentless power, for unlike many mercenaries, the Varangians developed a reputation for loyalty. Their bond was not to local factions or intrigues, but to the emperor himself, to whom they swore an oath of service. Within Constantinople they were more than soldiers. They were symbols of imperial strength, visible reminders that the emperor commanded the service of fearsome men from the ends of the earth. Their presence at court ceremonies added an air of awe, as their foreign appearance set them apart from local soldiers. They guarded the emperor's person, marched in processions, and stood watch in the palace, their tall frames and heavy axes unmistakable. In an empire known for intrigue and betrayal, their reputation for incorruptibility made them invaluable. For the Norse who joined, service in the Guard offered wealth and prestige. Byzantium paid generously, rewarding loyalty with gold, silver, and gifts. Many returned to Rus or Scandinavia with fortunes that elevated them at home. Others remained, integrating into Byzantine life, marrying local women, and leaving descendants who carried both Norse and Greek heritage. To serve in the Varangian Guard was to achieve not only riches but honor, for sagas remembered these men as heroes who had seen the wonders of the greatest city in Christendom. The cultural exchange was profound. Norsemen who had grown up in timber halls and turf houses encountered marble palaces and churches adorned with mosaics. They brought home not only wealth but also ideas of art, of faith, of governance that influenced their homelands. Some returned baptized, carrying Christianity back to the north long before official conversions took place. Others carried stories of Constantinople's marvels, fueling sagas that blended truth with awe. Byzantium too absorbed something of the north. The axes of the Varangians became part of imperial imagery, their foreignness used to reinforce the universality of the empire. The service of such men symbolized Byzantium's reach, extending even into the frozen seas of the north. Yet it was not without risk. the same ferocity that made them valuable could turn dangerous if loyalty faltered. Still, for centuries, the bond endured, and the Guard became one of the most trusted institutions of imperial power. The presence of the Varangian Guard reflected the transformation of Viking identity. From raiders feared on distant coasts, they had become defenders of emperors, respected not only for their strength, but for their steadfastness. Their axes, once instruments of plunder, now upheld the throne of Byzantium itself. In this unlikely service lay a testament to the adaptability of the Norse spirit, able to shift from plundering to protecting, from outsiders to insiders, without losing their essence as warriors. The legacy of the Guard would stretch into later centuries. Even after the Viking Age waned, Norsemen continued to seek service there, and their reputation endured as one of the most formidable elite corps of the medieval world. For the Empire, they were a bulwark. For the Norse, they were a path to wealth and honor. For history, they became one of the most vivid symbols of the strange and far-reaching journeys of the men of the North. The Viking Age had been shaped by belief as much as by steel. For centuries, the Norse carried with them a pantheon of gods: Odin, the All-Father; Thor, the Thunderer; Freya, the giver of fertility; Freyja, the keeper of love and death. Their myths told of a cosmos bound together by Yggdrasil, the world tree, and of a fate that would one day bring Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods. These stories infused their lives, guiding rituals, inspiring courage, and sanctifying the bonds of kin and honor. Yet as Norsemen sailed farther, traded wider, and encountered lands beyond their own, another faith pressed upon them: Christianity. The conversion of Scandinavia would not come quickly or peacefully, but it would eventually alter the course of their history forever. The first encounters with Christianity were practical rather than spiritual. As raiders plundered monasteries and churches, they carried away not only gold, but also symbols of a faith foreign to them. Crosses and reliquaries were melted down for treasure, but sometimes they were worn as amulets, admired for their craftsmanship, or believed to carry strange power. Traders, too, encountered Christians in the markets of Francia, England, and Byzantium. For Norse leaders, conversion was often less about personal belief than about diplomacy, for Christian rulers demanded the abandonment of pagan rites as a condition of alliance. In England, Alfred the Great's victory at Edington had already led to the baptism of Guthrum, the Viking leader forced into submission. In Francia, treaties often included clauses requiring raiders to accept baptism before tribute was paid. These conversions may have been nominal, yet they revealed the growing weight of Christian influence. In the East, service in the Varangian Guard exposed Norse warriors to the splendor of Byzantine Christianity, with its grand cathedrals and solemn liturgies. Step by step, exposure deepened, and what began as pragmatic gestures grew into genuine transformation. Back in Scandinavia, kings recognized the power Christianity offered. The old gods bound people to local cults and regional chieftains, but Christianity carried with it the authority of bishops, churches, and the prestige of Europe's great monarchies. To adopt the new faith was to align with a broader world, to claim legitimacy in the eyes of neighbors and rivals alike. Yet it was not without resistance. Paganism was woven into daily life: sacrifices at seasonal festivals, offerings at sacred groves, oaths sworn beneath the gaze of Thor's hammer. To abandon these traditions was to sever ties with ancestors and risk angering the gods. Norway's conversion reflected this struggle vividly. King Olaf Tryggvason, who reigned at the turn of the millennium, embraced Christianity and sought to spread it by force. He traveled across his realm, demanding the destruction of pagan temples and the baptism of chieftains. Resistance was fierce, yet Olaf pressed on, seeing in the new faith a unifying tool for his kingdom. His successor, Olaf Haraldsson, later remembered as Saint Olaf, continued the mission, wielding both sword and sermon to impose Christianity. His death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 turned him into a martyr, and veneration of his cult hastened Norway's acceptance of the faith. Denmark, too, moved toward conversion under King Harald Bluetooth, who in the late 10th century declared that he had united Denmark and brought Christianity to his people. The Jelling stones he raised proclaimed this transformation, marking a public declaration that the old ways were giving way to the new. Sweden followed more slowly, with pagan practices persisting alongside Christian ones, well into the 12th century, but even there the tide proved irreversible. The clash of faiths was not always violent. In many cases, Christianity and paganism coexisted for generations. Farmers might attend church on Sunday, yet still sacrifice to Thor for good harvests. Crosses and Thor's hammers were worn together, symbols of both new belief and old loyalty. Gradually, the rhythms of Christian ritual, baptism, marriage, burial, supplanted older rites, and the stories of Christ mingled with the sagas of Odin and Thor. The conversion brought profound changes. Churches rose in place of sacred groves, priests replaced skalds as keepers of memory, and written texts began to preserve what had once been oral tradition. The sagas themselves, written down in Christian Iceland, carried echoes of both worlds, pagan heroes remembered through the lens of Christian scribes. Law codes incorporated Christian morality, outlawing sacrifices and shaping customs in line with the wider European world. Scandinavia, once on the fringes, now became part of Christendom, tied by faith to neighbours it had once raided. Yet traces of the old faith endured. The mythology of the Norse gods, though suppressed, lived on in stories and in the very names of the days of the week. Festivals such as Yule were transformed into Christian celebrations but carried remnants of their pagan origins. Even as Christianity triumphed, the memory of Odin, Thor, and Freya continued to echo, shaping identity long after temples had been destroyed. The conversion of Scandinavia marked the end of the Viking Age in spirit as much as in fact. No longer pagans striking fear into Christian lands, the Norse became Christian kings and subjects themselves, integrated into the same order they had once defied. The twilight of the gods had come, but in their passing a new dawn arose, one that bound Scandinavia into the fabric of medieval Europe. By the dawn of the 11th century, the character of the Viking world had begun to change. What had once been an age of daring raids and sudden strikes was giving way to an era of kingship, settled kingdoms, and integration into the wider fabric of Europe. The longships still sailed, and warriors still bore axe and shield, but the conditions that had fueled the great age of raiding were shifting. The decline of Viking raids and the fading of their age was not sudden but gradual, by both external pressures and internal transformation. One of the greatest factors lay in the growing strength of European kingdoms. In the 8th and 9th centuries, political fragmentation had left coasts and rivers vulnerable. Monasteries stood isolated, and local rulers struggled to raise defences quickly enough. By the 11th century, however, rulers had consolidated power. Alfred the Great's reforms in Wessex had created fortified burhs, and his successors built on his legacy, uniting England into a stronger realm that could resist and even retaliate against Norse incursions. Francia, too, developed firmer defences, with castles and bridges that denied longships easy access to inland towns. Across Europe, lords and kings were better prepared, their armies more organised, their watchfulness sharpened by bitter experience. Another factor was the conversion of Scandinavia itself. As Denmark, Norway, and Sweden embraced Christianity, their rulers became less inclined to sanction raids against fellow Christians. Tribute once sought through terror was now pursued through diplomacy and alliance. The spread of churches, monasteries, and bishops tied Scandinavia to Christendom, replacing the independence of raiding chieftains with the order of kings who sought legitimacy in the Christian world. Olaf Tryggvason, Harold Bluetooth, and others had already begun this transformation, and by the 11th century it was well underway. Economic change also played a role. In the early centuries, raiding had been a means of acquiring silver, slaves, and goods that were scarce in Scandinavia. Over time, however, trade networks matured. Scandinavian merchants now dealt openly in markets from Dublin to Novgorod, exchanging timber, furs, and fish for the luxuries of Europe. Commerce became more profitable and sustainable than the dangers of raiding, and wealth accumulated through markets rather than plunder. Towns like Hedeby, Birka, and Kaupang flourished, their wharves crowded with ships not of raiders, but of traders. Yet decline did not mean disappearance. The 11th century still saw formidable figures rise from Scandinavia. Svein Forkbeard and his son Knut the Great carved out empires that spanned Denmark, England, and Norway, wielding power not through raids but through crowns. These kings embodied the transition from raider chiefs to monarchs, using armies and fleets to conquer and rule rather than plunder and flee. Their reigns demonstrated that the Viking spirit of expansion could endure, but now in the form of kingdoms rather than scattered bands of adventurers. Resistance from abroad, too, proved decisive. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 symbolized the twilight of Viking raiding. When Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded England with a vast host, he was met by King Harold Godwinson's forces and decisively defeated. Hardrada, remembered as one of the last great Viking kings, fell in battle, his dream of conquest shattered. Though raiding would not vanish entirely, the age of massive invasions and armies drawn from across Scandinavia had come to an end. The focus shifted inward, toward consolidation of power within Scandinavia itself. The fading of the Viking age was not only military and political, but cultural. The sagas that later recorded their deeds did so with a sense of distance, preserving memory rather than inspiring new adventures. Pagan gods, once worshipped in sacred groves, lived only in tales. The rune stones that stood in fields and churchyards became monuments to a passing era, carved with names of warriors who had sailed abroad but now commemorated in Christian lands. The balance of daily life shifted from raiding and wandering to farming, trading, and kingdom building. Yet the legacy of the Vikings endured. The towns they founded, Dublin, York, Kiev, continued to thrive long after their fleets ceased to dominate the seas. Their influence spread through language, law, and culture, leaving imprints across Britain, Ireland, Russia, and beyond. The very structure of kingdoms in Scandinavia owed much to the wealth and connections gained through centuries of raids and trade. Their ships, their sagas, their symbols of fear and freedom all remained, but transformed into heritage rather than present reality. The decline of raiding did not diminish the daring that had carried them across oceans and into legend. Instead, it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, where Scandinavia took its place within the wider Christian kingdoms of medieval Europe. The age of Vikings had closed, but its echoes would continue to shape memory, myth, and identity for centuries to come. The twilight of the Viking Age did not arrive without brilliance, for in its final century, Scandinavia produced rulers who extended their power farther than ever before. Chief among them was Knut the Great, son of Svein Forkbeard, whose reign forged what came to be known as the North Sea Empire. His story embodied the transformation of the Viking world, from raiders striking vulnerable shores to kings ruling across kingdoms, binding lands with law as well as steel. Svein Forkbeard had already set the stage. A formidable Danish king, he launched repeated campaigns against England in the early 11th century, exploiting divisions among the Anglo-Saxon nobility. His forces harried the coasts and pressed inland, exacting tribute known as Danegeld. In 1013, Svein succeeded in conquering England outright, forcing King Ethelred the Unready into exile. Yet his triumph was short-lived. He died suddenly the following year, leaving his realm in uncertainty. Into this storm stepped his son Knut, young but determined to claim both his father's legacy and his own place among the great rulers of Europe. At first, Knut's position was precarious. English nobles recalled Ethelred from exile, rallying resistance against the Danes. But Knut returned in force, leading armies reinforced from Denmark and Norway. His campaigns were brutal and methodical, combining the ferocity of Viking warbands with the organization of a king's army. Towns fell, nobles bent the knee, and by 1016, after the death of Edmund Ironside, Ethelred's son and successor, Knut secured the throne of England. A treaty divided the realm at first, but Edmund's sudden death left Knut undisputed master. Knut did not rule England as a mere conqueror. Instead, he sought to integrate himself into its traditions. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of Ethelred, strengthening ties with one of Europe's most powerful ducal families. He retained the structures of Anglo-Saxon governance, working through shires and earldoms, while placing loyal Danes in key positions to secure his authority. By blending Norse power with English custom, he created a stable realm that endured beyond conquest. From his base in England, Knut extended his reach across the sea. He inherited Denmark upon the death of his brother, uniting it with his English crown. In time, he asserted overlordship over Norway and parts of Sweden, creating a dominion that stretched across the North Sea. For a brief moment, the waters that had once carried raiders now lay at the center of an empire, ruled from multiple thrones. The North Sea became not a barrier, but a highway binding lands together, with Knut as its sovereign. Knut's reign was marked not only by war, but by statesmanship. He cultivated relations with the Church, presenting himself as a Christian king equal to any in Europe. He traveled to Rome, attended by a retinue that displayed both his wealth and his piety, and secured concessions for his people, including reduced tolls for English and Danish pilgrims. His generosity to monasteries and churches strengthened his legitimacy, transforming the image of Norse rulers from pagan marauders into Christian monarchs. Yet his rule was not free from tension. Balancing the interests of Danes, English, and Norwegians required constant vigilance. Earls such as Godwin of Wessex rose in prominence under his reign, laying the foundations of dynasties that would dominate English politics for generations. In Norway, resistance simmered, with figures like Olaf Haraldsson challenging his authority. Still, Knut maintained his empire through a mixture of diplomacy, force, and strategic marriages, keeping together lands that had once been bound only by the fleeting unity of raids. The vision of the North Sea Empire did not long outlive its creator. After Knut's death in 1035, his sons divided the realm, and rivalries quickly fractured its unity. England, Denmark, and Norway fell back into separate paths, each contested by competing claimants. Yet for a generation, Knut had demonstrated what Viking ambition could achieve when turned to kingship rather than raiding. His empire, though short-lived, stood as a culmination of centuries of Norse expansion, proving that the men of the North could not only plunder kingdoms, but rule them. Knut the Great remains a figure of paradox. To some, he was the last Viking conqueror, master of fleets and armies that struck fear across seas. To others, he was the first Scandinavian king to fully embrace Christian kingship, transforming raiders into rulers and linking Scandinavia into the political life of Europe. His empire was both an ending and a beginning, the close of the Viking Age as a time of raids, and the dawn of a new era where Scandinavian crowns would shape the medieval world in new forms. Harald Hardrada was a man of two worlds, heir to the traditions of Viking warlords and participant in the emerging order of medieval kingship. Born in Norway in 1015, he grew up amid turbulence, watching the legacy of Canute the Great fracture, and kingdoms across the north struggle for dominance. Exiled in his youth after a failed bid for the Norwegian throne, Harald's life carried him far beyond Scandinavia. His adventures spanned from the battlefields of Eastern Europe to the glittering halls of Byzantium, earning him both wealth and renown before he returned to stake his claim as one of the last great warrior kings of the Viking Age. Harald's path began when he joined the service of the Kievan Rus, fighting alongside the retainers of Prince Yaroslav the Wise. There, amid the forests and river routes, he gained experience in both strategy and survival. Yet it was in Byzantium that his legend truly took shape. Harald entered the service of the Varangian Guard, the elite corps of Norse warriors sworn to protect the Byzantine emperor. For nearly a decade he fought in distant campaigns, in Sicily, in the Holy Land, and against the empire's many foes. Chronicles remembered him as a formidable commander, amassing treasure and reputation alike. When Harald returned north, he carried with him not only riches but prestige. His years abroad had forged him into a seasoned warrior, his coffers filled with Byzantine gold. In 1046 he seized the Norwegian throne, sharing rule briefly with his nephew Magnus before claiming it outright. As king, Harald proved both ambitious and uncompromising. He strengthened royal authority, sought to expand influence into Denmark, and maintained the restless energy that had defined his youth. His reign was marked by both harsh rule at home and bold ventures abroad, a reflection of his character, unyielding, proud, and ever hungry for glory. Harald's eyes turned toward England, a land long tied to Norse ambitions. The death of Edward the Confessor in 1066 without a direct heir opened the realm to claimants. Harald believed he had a right to the throne through agreements made decades earlier between Canute's heirs and Magnus of Norway. Bolstered by this claim and driven by the warrior's desire for conquest, he assembled a great fleet. With support from Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's Harold Godwinson, Harald set sail to press his claim by force. The campaign began with success. Harold's army stormed ashore in northern England, defeating local forces at the Battle of Fulford near York. Victory seemed within reach, and the Norwegian king prepared to consolidate his position. Yet fortune turned swiftly. Harold Godwinson, newly crowned King of England, marched his army north with astonishing speed, covering miles in days to confront the invaders. The clash came at Stamford Bridge on 25 September 1066. The battle would become legendary, not only for its ferocity but for its symbolism as the end of an age. Harold's men, caught by surprise in the heat of late September, had left much of their armor at their ships. Yet they fought with the ferocity of seasoned warriors, forming shield walls that resisted the English onslaught. Saga tradition speaks of a lone Norseman holding the narrow bridge, felling dozens before being overcome. Such tales, whether wholly true or not, capture the spirit of the day, defiance even in the face of overwhelming odds. Harold himself fought bravely at the front, wielding sword and spear as he had in countless battles before. But fate claimed him when an arrow pierced his throat, ending the life of the last great Viking warrior king. His army, leaderless and battered, collapsed under the English assault. Survivors fled to their ships, and of the vast fleet that had sailed from Norway, only a fraction returned. The Battle of Stamford Bridge marked more than the death of Harald Hardrada. It symbolized the twilight of the Viking Age itself. No longer would Scandinavian kings launch great invasions in the old style, seeking to carve kingdoms abroad by sheer force of arms. Instead, they would turn inward, shaping the monarchies of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden within the framework of Christendom. The warrior spirit endured, but the age of longships as engines of conquest had passed. yet Harold's legacy lived on in memory. To Norse poets, he was Hardrada, the hard ruler, unyielding and unbending. His life carried the full arc of the Viking age: exile and adventure, service in Byzantium, kingship at home, and a final bid for glory abroad. His death closed the chapter begun centuries earlier with raids on Lindisfarne, sealing the Viking age in both triumph and tragedy. The year 1066 stands as one of the great turning points in European history, for it witnessed not only the end of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, but also the conquest of England by another ruler whose lineage traced back to the Vikings. William, Duke of Normandy, known to history as William the Conqueror, carried Norse blood through his ancestry. His forefathers had been Vikings who settled in northern France, granted land by the Frankish kings in the early 10th century. Over generations, these Norse settlers, called Northmen or Normans, adopted the French language, embraced Christianity, and fused with local culture, yet retained a martial spirit inherited from their ancestors. It was this legacy that William carried across the Channel in the autumn of 1066. The roots of Normandy lay in the treaty between King Charles the Simple of West Francia and the Viking leader Rollo around the year 911. Rollo and his followers had ravaged the Seine Valley until a settlement was reached. In exchange for peace and defense against further raids, Rollo was granted land around Rouen. His descendants expanded this duchy, and within a century, Normandy became a formidable principality. The Normans blended Norse vigor with Frankish feudalism, producing a society of disciplined warriors, fortified castles, and ambitious leaders. By William's time, Normandy was one of the most powerful regions in France, known for both its military skill and its restless appetite for expansion. When Edward the Confessor of England died childless in January 1066, the throne was contested. Harold Godwinson, the leading English noble, was crowned king, but William claimed that Edward had promised him succession during an earlier visit to Normandy. Furthermore, William argued that Harold had sworn an oath of loyalty to him, an oath later broken when Harold took the crown. To William, this was both a betrayal and an opportunity. He secured papal support for his claim, raising a banner blessed by the Pope, and summoned knights and soldiers from across Normandy and beyond. His preparations were vast, assembling ships, horses, and men for the crossing. While Harold Godwinson rushed north to meet Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, William waited patiently in Normandy, delayed by adverse winds. Only after Harold's victory and the death of Hardrada did the winds shift, allowing William to sail. In late September, his fleet landed unopposed on the Sussex coast, and his men fortified their camp at Hastings. Harold, weary from his northern campaign, marched his army south at remarkable speed, determined to confront this new invader before he could entrench his hold. On 14th of October 1066, the two armies met near Hastings. The battle was long and bitter, lasting from morning until evening. Harold's Englishmen fought on foot, forming a dense shield wall along a ridge. Their discipline and courage held against repeated Norman assaults. William, mounted on horseback, directed charges of cavalry and archers, seeking to break the wall. Time and again, the Normans were repulsed, until feigned retreats lured portions of the English line into pursuit, where they were cut down. Gradually, gaps appeared, and Norman persistence began to tell. The turning point came when Harold fell, struck by an arrow, so tradition holds, in the eye, and then overwhelmed by Norman knights. With their king dead, English resistance faltered, and William secured the field. The victory was decisive, granting him the crown of England and forever altering the destiny of the island. In Christmas of that year, William was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, his authority enforced by sword and oath alike. The Norman conquest was more than a change of rulers. It reshaped England. Norman castles rose across the land, symbols of domination and centers of control. The aristocracy was transformed, as Anglo-Saxon lords were displaced by Norman knights loyal to William. The English language itself absorbed thousands of French words, laying the foundation for the blend that would become Middle English. Law, architecture, and culture all shifted, binding England more closely to continental Europe. Yet behind William's triumph lay the legacy of Viking expansion. The Normans were descendants of Norse raiders who had once terrorized the Seine Valley. Through adaptation and assimilation, they had become French in tongue and Christian in faith, yet they retained the audacity and military skill of their forebears. In William's conquest, the spirit of the Viking age lingered, not in dragon-headed ships but in mailed cavalry charging across the fields of Sussex. Thus 1066 marked both an end and a continuation. The death of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge closed the era of great Viking invasions, while William's victory at Hastings carried forward the legacy of Norse conquest in a new form. The Viking Age, as it had been known, was over, yet its influence remained, reshaped through the Normans who now ruled England and extended their reach into history. The conquest of England by William of Normandy drew a line under the age of Viking invasions, yet Norse influence in the British Isles endured long after the last longship fleets had vanished from the horizon. Across England, Ireland, and Scotland, the legacy of Viking settlement remained in place: names, laws, customs, and bloodlines. The Danelaw, though absorbed into a united kingdom, had left deep imprints on society. In Ireland, towns founded by Norse settlers became centres of commerce and power. In Scotland, Norse rule lingered along the northern and western Isles for centuries. The age of raids had ended, but the Norse were no longer outsiders. They had become part of the very fabric of the Isles. The Danelaw had been carved out in the 9th and 10th centuries, when the great heathen army and its successors established control over eastern and northern England. In these regions, Norse law, custom, and settlement patterns took root. Towns such as York, Lincoln, and Derby flourished under Scandinavian rule, their markets bustling with goods from across the seas. Even after Alfred and his successors reclaimed much of England, the Danelaw persisted as a cultural frontier. Old Norse words seeped into the English tongue, words for everyday life, for law, for seafaring, leaving their mark on the language itself. To this day, English speakers unknowingly echo the voices of Viking settlers when they speak of sky, window, law, or husband. Place names, too, carried memory. Villages ending in by, meaning farm, or settlement, or thorp, meaning village, dotted the English landscape, testifying to Scandinavian roots. In the countryside, boundaries of fields and customs of inheritance reflected Norse influence. The blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions created a hybrid culture, where warriors, once divided by faith and bloodline, became neighbours, farmers, and kin. By the time of the Norman conquest, the Danelaw was no longer a foreign enclave, but part of a shared English realm, though its Norse heritage remained unmistakable. Ireland bore a different story. Viking raids had devastated its monasteries in the 9th century, yet the Norse did not remain raiders only. They settled along the coasts, establishing towns that would outlast their original founders. Dublin, founded as a Viking longfort or ship fortress, grew into a thriving hub of trade, linking Ireland with the wider Viking world. Waterford, Limerick, and Cork likewise emerged from Norse settlements. These towns became bridges between Irish kingdoms and the markets of Scandinavia, Francia, and beyond. Silver, slaves, furs, and goods flowed through their harbours, transforming Ireland from a patchwork of rural kingdoms into a land tied to international commerce. The Norse in Ireland gradually intermarried with local populations, producing the Hiberno-Norse, a community that blended Scandinavian and Gaelic traditions. Their influence extended into politics as Viking leaders allied with or fought against Irish kings, shifting the balance of power. Though the Irish eventually reasserted dominance, the towns remained, carrying forward the legacy of their Norse founders. Dublin in particular became a jewel of Viking Ireland, remembered not as a raided monastery, but as a city born of longships. In Scotland, Norse influence was even more enduring. The northern isles of Orkney and Shetland, as well as the Hebrides and parts of the western coast, came under Norse control. Here, settlers established farms, built churches, and ruled as jarls under the overlordship of Norwegian kings. The sagas of Orkney told of these jarls, their feuds, and their alliances, embedding Norse history into Scottish soil. In the Hebrides, Norse and Gaelic cultures intertwined, producing a maritime society that looked outward to the sea as much as inward to the land. For centuries, these regions remained tied to Norway more closely than to Scotland, until political shifts in the late Middle Ages altered the balance. The cultural impact of Viking settlement across the Isles cannot be overstated. The Norse brought with them shipbuilding skills, trade networks, and a martial tradition that reshaped local politics. They contributed to the urbanization of Ireland, the hybridization of law in England, and the maritime orientation of Scotland's northern and western isles. Though the days of dragon-prowed ships were gone, the inheritance of the Norse endured in stone, speech, and custom. By the 11th century, the Viking Age as an age of raids had passed, but the Viking world as a cultural force remained alive in the Isles. The English spoke a language enriched by Norse words, Irish towns thrived on Norse foundations, and Scottish Isles lived under Norse rule. The transformation from raiders to settlers had reshaped not only Scandinavia, but the lands they had touched. In this sense, the legacy of Viking settlement proved as lasting as any raid, for it lived on in the very identities of the peoples who inherited it. The influence of the Norse extended deep into continental Europe, reshaping regions far beyond their original homelands. While the British Isles bore the brunt of raids and settlements, the continent experienced both devastation and transformation at the hands of Viking adventurers. Nowhere was this more evident than in Normandy, where descendants of Norse raiders evolved into one of medieval Europe's most dynamic powers. Beyond Normandy, Scandinavia itself was drawn into the orbit of Christendom, its kingdoms emerging from tribal chieftaincies into centralized monarchies. The Viking Age had begun with chaos and plunder, but it ended with integration into the medieval order. Normandy stood as the clearest example of this transformation. Founded when the Viking leader Rollo accepted land from King Charles the Simple in 911, Normandy was intended as a defensive measure, a buffer against further Norse raids along the Seine. Yet the gift became the seed of a duchy that flourished. The Normans, as Rollo's descendants came to be called, embraced the French language, adopted Christianity, and absorbed the structures of feudal society. Within a few generations, they had become indistinguishable from their Frankish neighbors in culture, yet they retained the military vigor and adaptability of their Norse ancestors. Norman society was marked by a fusion of traditions. Their warriors were skilled horsemen, adopting cavalry tactics that contrasted with the sea-borne raids of their forebears. Their castles, rising in stone and timber across the duchy, projected power and discipline. Their rulers, such as Richard the Fearless and Richard the Good, expanded territory and strengthened ducal authority. By the time of William the Conqueror, Normandy was not merely a duchy defending the Seine Valley, but a powerhouse capable of conquering England. The conquest of 1066 demonstrated that Norse expansion had not ended but had been transformed, channeling itself through feudal armies rather than longship fleets. Norman influence extended far beyond England. In the 11th century, Norman adventurers pressed into southern Italy, carving out territories in Apulia and Calabria. They challenged Byzantine and Muslim rulers, eventually establishing the Kingdom of Sicily under Roger the Schelp, a realm celebrated for its cultural diversity and wealth. These conquests carried Norse-descended rulers to the very heart of the Mediterranean, where they stood alongside emperors and popes as arbiters of European politics. The Normans of Sicily, though centuries removed from their Viking forebears, retained a restless drive for expansion that echoed their ancestry. While Norman power flourished abroad, Scandinavia itself was undergoing transformation. The conversion to Christianity brought the authority of bishops and the structure of the church into Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish society. Kingship grew more centralized, with rulers like Olaf Haraldsson in Norway and Harald Bluetooth in Denmark using Christian legitimacy to bind their realms together. Assemblies of free men still met, but royal power increasingly overshadowed local chieftains. Scandinavia, once fragmented and tribal, became a region of monarchies tied into the wider network of Christendom. Economically, Scandinavia shifted from raiding to trading. Towns such as Lund, Roskilde, and Trondheim grew around churches and markets, reflecting both spiritual and commercial integration. Silver no longer came from plunder, but from exchange, as Scandinavian merchants dealt in fish, timber, and furs. The trade routes established during the Viking Age continued to thrive, but now they carried pilgrims, clerics, and merchants rather than raiding bands. The Norse became participants in the rhythms of medieval commerce, their ships still vital, but their purpose transformed. The cultural consequences of this integration were profound. Runestones once carved with pagan symbols now bore Christian crosses. Saga traditions continued, but they were increasingly written down by Christian scribes, blending old heroic tales with the moral frameworks of the new faith. Scandinavian art, once dominated by interlacing beasts and mythic motifs, began to incorporate Christian iconography, though often in hybrid forms that revealed the persistence of older traditions. The Norse world was not erased, but reshaped, its identity carried into new expressions that bound it to Europe while preserving echoes of its past. Normandy and Scandinavia thus illustrate two sides of the same transformation. In Normandy, Norsemen became French-speaking dukes and kings, reshaping Europe through conquest and statecraft. In Scandinavia, pagan chieftains became Christian monarchs, drawing their realms into the orbit of Europe's kingdoms. Both paths marked the end of the Viking Age and the beginning of medieval Scandinavia's place within Christendom. The dragon-headed ships no longer prowled foreign coasts, but their legacy endured in castles, kingdoms, and chronicles that bore the imprint of Norse ambition. The Viking Age left behind more than conquests and settlements. Its deepest and most enduring legacy lay in the cultural treasures preserved through story, verse, and stone. While the clang of axes and the roar of longships faded, the memory of the age lived on in sagas recited in Iceland, in skaldic poetry composed in Scandinavian courts, and in runes carved on monuments across the north. Through these mediums, the Norse people carried their past into the future, ensuring that their world would not be forgotten even after their raids had ceased. The sagas of Iceland form the crown jewel of this cultural inheritance. Composed in the 13th and 14th centuries, but rooted in oral traditions centuries older, the sagas preserved the lives and deeds of Viking families, chieftains, and explorers. They told of settlement in Iceland, of feuds that spanned generations, of voyages to Greenland and Vinland, and of kings who ruled in Norway and Denmark. The sagas combined history with legend, portraying men and women in stark detail, proud, flawed, courageous, vengeful, and bound by honor. Unlike the romances of continental Europe, the sagas were unsparing in their realism, depicting not only heroic deeds, but also the harshness of fate and the cost of pride. The family sagas, such as Njal's saga and Egil's saga, illuminated the society of Iceland in vivid strokes. They describe disputes over land, alliances sealed by marriage, and the grim cycles of vengeance that shaped communities. Heroes like Egil Skallagrimsson, both warrior and poet, embodied the contradictions of the Norse spirit, brutal in combat yet capable of verses of haunting beauty. Through these stories, the Icelanders preserved the world of their ancestors not as distant myth, but as lived experience rendered with clarity and depth. Skaldic poetry, older than the sagas, carried the voice of the Viking Age itself. Skalds were poets attached to courts, composing intricate verses in praise of kings and warriors. Their poetry, woven with kennings, metaphorical phrases like whale road for sea or battle sweat for blood, encapsulated the artistry of Norse language. Skaldic verse was not only entertainment but also a record of events, a means of preserving history in oral form. Kings valued skalds as chroniclers of their deeds, their verses serving both as propaganda and as testimony. Runes offered another form of memory. The runic alphabet known as the futhark had long been used for inscriptions, charms, and memorials. During the Viking Age, rune stones multiplied across Scandinavia. These stones, often raised in memory of the dead, bore inscriptions that recorded voyages, battles, and family ties. Many included Christian crosses alongside traditional motifs, reflecting the transition of the age. Rune stones served as both monuments to individuals and as public affirmations of identity, standing in fields and churchyards as voices carved into stone. Mythology too endured through preservation and transformation. The gods of Asgard, Odin, Thor, Loki, and others, remained alive in the poetic Edda and the prose Edda, collections compiled in Iceland that recorded the old myths even as Christianity had taken root. These works preserved the cosmology of the Norse, their vision of creation and destruction, of the Norns who wove fate, and the doom of Ragnarok that awaited all. Far from disappearing, these myths became part of Europe's literary heritage, influencing poets, artists, and thinkers long after the Viking Age ended. The cultural legacy of the Vikings extended beyond words and symbols. Art and craftsmanship revealed their aesthetic, interlacing animal designs, dragon-headed prows, and jewelry adorned with intricate patterns. Their artistry traveled with them, influencing styles across the regions they touched. Weapons, brooches, and ships bore the hallmarks of a people who valued both function and beauty, leaving behind objects that today fill museums as testaments to their skill. In Iceland in particular, the preservation of memory became a mission. Isolated yet literate, the Icelanders wrote down sagas and eddas, transforming oral tradition into written heritage. Their efforts ensured that the stories of the Viking Age did not vanish with time, but were passed to later generations who could still hear the voices of their ancestors. Without this devotion, much of the Norse world would have been lost, drowned in the tides of history. Thus, the cultural legacy of the Viking Age lived on long after the raids and conquests had ceased. Through sagas, skaldic poetry, runes, and myths, the Norse ensured that their world remained alive in memory and imagination. Their ships no longer sailed to foreign shores, but their stories continued to travel, shaping how future ages understood the men and women of the North. Beyond the thunder of battle and the sweep of great voyages lay the heart of Viking life, the rhythms of ordinary existence. For most men and women of the North, the Viking Age was not defined by raids or kingdoms, but by the cycles of farming, the raising of families, and the struggle to endure long winters. Daily life in Scandinavia revolved around the land and the sea, woven with customs and traditions that bound communities together as firmly as kinship ties. The typical Viking household centered on the farmstead. Built of timber or turf depending on the region, long houses stretched low against the landscape, their walls thick to guard against the cold, their roofs layered with thatch or sod. Within, the family lived and worked in close quarters, hearth fires providing warmth and light. The longhouse was not merely shelter, but the nucleus of life, a place for cooking, weaving, storytelling, and decision-making. Families were large, often including extended kin, thralls, and hired laborers, all bound together under the authority of the household head. Farming formed the backbone of survival. Barley and rye were the primary crops used for bread and for ale, the staple drink of the north. Hay was harvested in summer to feed livestock during the long winters. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs provided milk, wool, meat, and hides. Horses, though fewer in number, were valued for travel and status. Every season carried its labors, ploughing in spring, harvesting in summer, slaughtering and storing in autumn, and enduring in winter. The year's rhythm was dictated by necessity, each task a link in the chain of survival. Fishing supplemented farming, especially along coasts and fjords. Nets and hooks drew cod, herring, and salmon from the waters, while seals and whales were hunted where possible. Boats were not only for raiding, but for everyday work, carrying families across fjords, transporting goods, and linking scattered communities. Trade in surplus, wool, hides, or dried fish, allowed even remote farmers to participate in the larger economy, exchanging their goods for iron, salt, or luxuries from abroad. Gender roles in Viking society, though distinct, carried both responsibility and respect. Men were expected to farm, fight, and travel, but women held authority within the household. They managed the stores, oversaw weaving and dairy production, and often controlled keys that symbolized their role as keepers of the home. Women could inherit property, initiate divorce, and manage estates in their husband's absence. While warriors carried swords, women carried the weight of continuity, ensuring the survival of families and the transmission of culture. Some sagas even tell of shield maidens, women who fought alongside men, though whether these figures were rare realities or heroic ideals remains debated. Children were raised with labor and discipline. From an early age, they learned the skills necessary for survival, tending animals, spinning wool, repairing tools, or handling small boats. Education was practical, though sagas suggest that storytelling and poetry also played roles in shaping young minds. Boys grew into warriors or farmers, girls into wives and household managers, though the boundaries could shift depending on circumstance. Life expectancy was modest, and many children did not survive to adulthood, making each new life precious. Religion infused daily life with meaning. Sacrifices were made at seasonal festivals, blots, to honor gods such as Freya for fertility, Thor for protection, and Odin for wisdom. Sacred groves, stones, and springs served as sites of worship, linking communities to the divine cycles of nature. With the coming of Christianity, churches gradually replaced these sites, yet the old rituals often lingered alongside the new, blending faiths in the practical spirituality of farming communities. Thralls, or slaves, formed the lowest stratum of society. Captured in raids or born into servitude, they worked the fields, tended animals, and served in households. Though lacking freedom, some thralls could earn release or be granted it, becoming freedmen with limited rights. The presence of thralls reveals that Viking society, though often celebrated for its independence, was also built on hierarchy and inequality. Despite hardships, Viking communities found room for joy and festivity. Feasts marked the harvest or the return of warriors from abroad. Mead and ale flowed, songs and sagas were recited, and games of strength and skill enlivened gatherings. Board games such as Hnefatafl, a strategic contest akin to chess, tested wits, while wrestling and horse fights displayed physical prowess. These moments of leisure and celebration balanced the rigors of labor, reinforcing bonds of kinship and community. Daily life in Viking society was thus a tapestry of endurance and culture, woven from the demands of survival and the expressions of identity. Farmers and fishers, women and children, thralls and freemen all contributed to the resilience of their world. The great raids and voyages may have defined the Viking Age in chronicles, but in truth, it was sustained by the quiet strength of those who tilled the soil, managed the hearth, and raised new generations beneath the northern sky. The Viking world was held together by its ships. More than weapons or swords, it was the mastery of shipbuilding that allowed the men of the north to reach across oceans, rivers, and coasts, carrying their influence from Vinland to Byzantium. Viking ships were not merely vessels of transport. They were the engines of the age, expressions of craftsmanship, technology, and culture that defined the possibilities of exploration, trade, and conquest. At the heart of this maritime achievement stood the longship. Sleek and symmetrical, the longship was designed for speed, agility, and versatility. Its hull was long and narrow, built with overlapping planks of oak fastened together with iron rivets, a technique known as clinker or lapstrake construction. This method created a hull both strong and flexible, capable of withstanding the harsh waves of the North Atlantic, while remaining light enough to be hauled over land. The shallow draft of the longship allowed it to sail close to shore, ascend rivers, and land directly on beaches, enabling surprise raids and swift retreats. The longship was powered by both sail and oar. A single square sail of wool, often dyed red or striped with bold colors, captured the wind, while rows of oars provided propulsion when the breeze failed. Warriors could row in rhythm, driving the ship forward with steady force, or raise the oars in salute as they entered harbors. The combination of sail and oar gave the longship unmatched versatility, able to cross open seas, yet maneuver inland where larger vessels could not follow. Decoration imbued the ships with meaning beyond function. Many bore carved prows, most famously in the form of dragon or serpent heads designed to terrify enemies and ward off spirits. Shields lined the sides, both practical in battle and symbolic of unity. To see a fleet of longships approaching, their sails swelling, their prows snarling, and their shields gleaming, was to see power incarnate. For those who faced them, the image was unforgettable. For those aboard, it was a source of pride and identity. Yet the longship was not the only vessel of the Viking Age. The Nar, a broader, sturdier ship, served for trade and migration. Built with higher sides and greater cargo capacity, it carried goods, livestock, and families across the seas. It was the Nar, not the longship, that brought settlers to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, its design suited to endurance and storage rather than speed. Fishing boats and coastal craft complemented these larger vessels, ensuring that maritime life permeated every level of society. The skill of shipbuilding was itself a communal achievement. Timber was carefully selected, often oak for strength and pine for lighter planks. Iron rivets and nails were forged by blacksmiths, while wool sails required months of spinning, weaving, and dyeing. A single ship represented the labor of many: carpenters, smiths, weavers, and farmers whose livestock provided the wool. The launching of a ship was a moment of ceremony, often accompanied by offerings to the gods, for the sea was as much a realm of danger as of opportunity. Seamanship matched craftsmanship. Navigators relied on keen observation of the sun, stars, winds, and waves. Birds, whales, and even the color of the sea guided them near coasts, while sunstones, crystals that polarized light, may have been used to locate the sun on cloudy days. Experience was passed down through generations, knowledge stored not in maps but in memory and story. It was this skill that carried Norsemen across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond, long before compasses reached Europe. The ships of the Vikings were not merely tools of war or trade, they were symbols of freedom and ambition. To own a ship was to hold the power of mobility, the ability to strike, to flee, to explore. Ships bound communities across seas, linking distant settlements into a shared Norse world. They also carried identity into the afterlife, for some chieftains were buried in ships, their vessels transformed into tombs that symbolized eternal voyages. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships, preserved in Norwegian burial mounds, stand today as testaments to the artistry and reverence with which these vessels were crafted. Without ships, the Viking Age would not have been possible. With them, the Norse transcended the limits of their homelands, reaching across continents and into legend. Each plank, each sail, each carving embodied the restless spirit of a people for whom the sea was both path and destiny. The reputation of the Vikings as fearsome warriors was not built on numbers alone, but on the effectiveness of their methods. In open fields, in river valleys, or on storm-swept coasts, they employed tactics that magnified their strengths and exploited the weaknesses of their opponents. Viking warfare combined discipline, innovation, and sheer ferocity, making their small bands of fighters formidable even against the larger armies of kingdoms and empires. The backbone of Viking combat was the shield wall. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, round shields overlapping to form a barrier of wood and iron. Behind this wall, spears thrust outward, axes swung, and swords darted through gaps. The shield wall demanded cohesion, for if it broke, the line collapsed. In battle, chants and roars accompanied the crash of shields, creating a rhythm that united the fighters and intimidated their foes. Against less disciplined enemies, the shield wall could grind forward relentlessly, each step a surge of pressure. Viking armies excelled in mobility. Their longships allowed them to strike suddenly, land where defenses were weakest, and retreat before enemies could gather. This mobility carried into their tactics on land. They avoided prolonged sieges unless absolutely necessary, preferring quick raids, ambushes, and sudden attacks. When they did besiege towns or monasteries, they used fire, battering, and intimidation rather than elaborate siege engines. Their strength lay not in prolonged campaigns, but in decisive strikes that broke morale and seized wealth. Feigned retreats were among their most cunning strategies. Pretending to flee in disorder, they lured opponents into pursuit, only to turn suddenly and counterattack when the enemy lines were stretched and broken. This tactic, used at times in Francia and England, revealed their ability to adapt and exploit psychology as much as brute force. Surprise was their constant ally, whether in the form of a dawn raid, a sudden landing far upriver, or a deceptive maneuver on the battlefield. Organization within Viking armies reflected their social structures. Warbands were composed of freemen bound by loyalty to a leader, often a jarl or king. These men brought their own weapons and armor, their quality varying with wealth. At the core stood professional warriors, seasoned by years of raiding, who formed the elite. Around them gathered younger men seeking glory and wealth, and thralls who supported with labor. Bonds of loyalty reinforced by oath and gift held these warbands together, ensuring that warriors fought not only for plunder, but for honor and obligation. Weapons were both practical and symbolic. Spears were the most common, inexpensive and versatile, capable of both thrusting and throwing. Axes, ranging from small hand axes to great two-handed varieties, were feared for their power to cleave shields and helmets. Swords, costly and prized, were often passed down through generations, their blades inscribed with patterns of steel that testified to the smith's skill. The seax, a long knife, was nearly universal, serving in both daily life and combat. Helmets, when available, offered protection, though the horned helmets of modern imagination never graced Viking heads. Mail armor was rare, reserved for the wealthy, while most fought in padded garments or leather. Psychology played a central role in Viking warfare. They cultivated fear deliberately, striking with suddenness and sparing little. The reputation of berserkers, warriors said to fight in frenzied states, impervious to pain, added to this aura of terror. Whether berserkers were a distinct class or a legend magnified by chronicles, their image reinforced the idea of the Vikings as warriors beyond reason, unstoppable until death. Enemies often broke before true combat began, undone by dread as much as by steel. Naval warfare extended their dominance. Longships could be lashed together to form floating fortresses, their decks bristling with warriors. Coastal raids often began with overwhelming force, ships landing in unison to disgorge fighters in disciplined ranks. On rivers, ships could outmaneuver defenders, slipping past blockades or launching strikes deep into inland territories. The combination of naval agility and land discipline created a synergy few kingdoms could counter effectively. Viking warfare was not chaos but a calculated blend of order and ferocity. Shield walls, feigned retreats, surprise raids, and psychological terror worked together to magnify their impact. What they lacked in numbers, they compensated with speed, cohesion, and the will to press advantages without hesitation. For centuries, these methods carried them across Europe, carving out reputations as warriors feared even by kings. The Viking Age ended as a historical era, but it never disappeared from memory. Its ships no longer prowled the rivers of Francia or the coasts of England, yet the legacy of the men and women of the North endured in culture, law, language, and imagination. The sagas and eddas carried their voices into the written word, while place names, traditions, and bloodlines preserved their presence across Europe. Long after their raids had ceased, the Vikings remained a force, not of steel and fire, but of story and heritage. In England, their imprint was indelible. The Danelaw had vanished into the larger kingdom, but Norse words lived on in the English tongue. Everyday speech echoed with their influence. Sky, law, window, husband, and hundreds more bore witness to Scandinavian settlement. Towns founded or renamed by Norse settlers dotted the map, their endings in by or Thorpe still visible today. Even the political unity forged by Alfred and his descendants had been shaped in response to the Viking threat, making the invaders unwitting architects of the English nation. In Ireland, Norsemen had begun as destroyers of monasteries, but ended as founders of cities. Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, these towns became lasting legacies of Viking settlement, growing into hubs of trade and culture. The Hiberno-Norse communities that emerged blended Gaelic and Scandinavian traditions, their descendants continuing to shape Irish history long after the Viking Age closed. In Scotland, the Northern and Western Isles bore Norse rule for centuries, their sagas and traditions lingering even as power shifted to Scottish kings. On the continent, Normandy carried forward the Viking legacy in a different form. From Rollo's settlement came a duchy that produced William the Conqueror and the Normans of Sicily, rulers who reshaped the medieval world. Their blend of Norse vigor and Frankish order extended Viking influence long past the age of raids. Even in Byzantium, the memory of the Varangian Guard endured, tall, axe-bearing warriors who had stood at the heart of imperial power, their loyalty remembered long after their northern homelands turned Christian. In Scandinavia itself, the Viking Age laid the foundation for kingdoms that became part of Christendom. The unification of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden emerged from centuries of chieftains and raiders, crystallizing into monarchies that would endure into the modern age. Christianity transformed their beliefs, yet the myths of Odin, Thor, and Loki lingered in memory, preserved in Icelandic manuscripts that later generations would cherish as literature. Runes gave way to Latin script, but their stones still stood in fields, silent witnesses to journeys and lives of a distant time. The legacy of the Viking Age extended even further into imagination. Medieval chroniclers cast the Norse as scourges sent by God, instruments of punishment and terror. Later centuries turned them into symbols of freedom and heroism, celebrating their voyages and valor. In the 19th century, the sagas inspired poets, artists, and nationalists who saw in the Vikings both ancestral pride and a romantic vision of untamed strength. In modern times, the Viking image has been reshaped again, appearing in novels, films, and popular culture as explorers, warriors, and adventurers. Yet beneath the myths lies a truth more complex. The Vikings were raiders and settlers, traders and poets, pagans and Christians, destroyers and founders. Their age was one of violence, but also of creativity, of upheaval, but also of transformation. They shaped kingdoms, founded cities, and carried their influence from the shores of North America to the gates of Constantinople. The Viking Age was not simply an age of war, it was an age of connection, binding the North to the wider world. Its end did not erase its meaning. The people of the North had entered history with fire and steel, and they remained within it through law, language, and story. Their age had passed, but their memory endured, a testament to the power of ships, songs, and the human will to venture beyond horizons. The Viking Age lives on not in raids, but in the cultures and nations that carry its inheritance, a chapter of history whose echoes still reach across the centuries.